Knock knock. That was the sound I heard at my door in the middle of the night. Even my master had told me to always stay alert at the inn. Loaded and ready, I prepared to attack, but when I opened the door, it was only the innkeeper's mistress. Only God knew what she wanted.
Yeah, boy.
A few hours earlier, I'd been traveling through the desert when I came across a group of people who offered to give me directions. To my surprise, they were bandits aiming to rob me. They really did pick the wrong time. With just a wave of my hand, I lifted all of them into the air. They hung there, confused, before they could even get their bearings. I pulled out a bottle, conjured water from it, and shaped the water into spikes. Before they could react, I struck one of them down. Their leader immediately went into surrender mode, but he was only buying time for his men to attack. With a single stomp of my foot, I summoned sand spikes and killed the rest of them. I asked the leader why they'd attacked me. He simply said it was because I'd bowed my head. Even when he spoke to me rudely, I had still bowed and greeted them properly. Before he could finish explaining, he saw his life flash before his eyes. I wasn't always this cruel. In this world, wizards stand at the pinnacle of all races, above nobles and knights, who inherited the ability to wield mysterious powers from our ancestors. When I was 10, my innate talent awakened. Instead of being happy about it, my mother shouted at me for the first time in my life. Then she made me promise that I would never use this power in front of anyone, ever again. I didn't understand why, so she told me the story she'd told countless times before, a story about people who wielded special abilities, wizards, who were either nobles or knights, but the two were worlds apart. Nobles were descendants of divine beings, the Freyans, who had descended to save humanity. Knights were descendants of those nobles, their blood mixed with humans. Then she told me why I could never use my abilities. I had inherited my father's power, a knight's power. And in this world, most nobles treated knights as slaves, so I had to promise never to use it. I couldn't keep that promise. 8 years later, stories of monsters appearing near town began to spread, and the village chief went out to request a wizard's help, since without one, killing the beast would be impossible. Someone asked whether the villagers already knew, and wondered aloud about the shepherd on the hill. Turan. That was me. At the time, I was just relaxing. Life was so boring. The same scenery, the same day, over and over. Honestly, at this rate, I felt like I might forget how to talk. Then I heard a voice. It was the old man from the village, scolding me for slacking off, even though the sheep weren't even his. I told him to move along. Looking at his expression, I wondered if he was still hung up on that old incident. Oh, right, that one. After my mother died, he tried to turn our sheep into shared property, as if I wasn't kind enough to go around sharing my mother's inheritance, so I told him to get lost. That angered him, but after one look at my face, he quickly got to the point. A monster had appeared, the size of a house. The old man seemed surprised that I wasn't scared, even though I was clearly the most likely one to be sent after it. Robus admitted that I was insanely brave, and said he did not even know why I was that way. He let me know that the village chief had already gone to the city to request a wizard, and urged me to be careful, saying it was only because he worried about me. I argued that he was not worried about me at all, that he was really only worried about his sheep. Robus looked ready to lose his temper at that, but I simply told him to make himself scarce since I was done saying what I wanted to say. I even added that his breath stank so badly, and he walked away, looking dejected. As for monsters, they are beasts that wield mysterious power and magic, the same way wizards stand above ordinary humans. I felt excited at the thought of finally seeing a wizard in person, though I was not entirely convinced this one would be anything special, given that it was only a rural village requesting help. Still, I wanted to see for myself how strong a real wizard could be. Moments later, I caught the scent of blood and followed it. It was not long before I found what remained of the old man who had just come to warn me to be careful. He had been torn apart like paper. I found it almost absurd that the very man who had come to caution me was the one who ended up dead first. I kept my expression cold and unreadable as I examined the body, and I could tell right away that no ordinary wild animal had done this. It had to be the monster. Before I could finish working out the details, the culprit emerged from the forest, matching the description exactly. It carried a dark aura, its size massive, its face fierce and terrifying. Monsters like this were said to be so overwhelmingly strong that ordinary humans stood no chance against them. Robus's son, hearing this, feared their village was finished, but his father reassured him that the wizard would handle it, insisting that a real wizard could subdue a monster with nothing more than a single word. Facing the monster myself, I felt no fear at all. I told it calmly to die. A massive wave of force struck it, sending it stumbling backward, but it remained just as strong as before. I stood there in silence, my first attack having failed, and while I searched my mind for another approach, the monster lunged at me. I spoke another command, ordering it to stop, but the attack barely missed me. It surprised me that neither command word had worked. Before I could react further, the monster turned on me again in fury. I leapt back to dodge and decided it was time to stop holding back. Falling into the stance of a shepherd, I drew out my sling, loaded it with a stone, and used magic to harden a projectile before launching it toward the monster. The impact sent a massive shockwave rippling through the monster's body, but it still was not enough to kill it. The monster charged at me, unaware that the stone was not finished. It was already curving back through the air like a boomerang, aiming straight for the back of its head. With tremendous force, the stone tore through its skull from behind before it ever reached me. The impact was so violent that the monster collapsed to the ground, dead. I remained completely calm through it all. Afterward, I dragged its body off to dump it in the valley, thinking to myself how the villagers always seemed to find new ways to stress me out. The next morning, I received an unexpected visit from a group of angry villagers. They banged on my door without any courtesy, demanding that I come out. As it turned out, they had come to accuse me of killing Robus. The one leading the group grabbed me by the collar and called me shameless, claiming that I had hurt Robus before throwing him out to be eaten by monsters. I calmly told him I understood exactly why they wanted to frame me. The oldest man in the village had died alone, while the younger men were too afraid to fight the monster themselves, and pinning the blame on me was simply the easiest way for them to shift it away from themselves. That comment enraged him and he threw a punch at my face, which I dodged with ease. I countered with a headbutt that sent blood pouring from his nose. Deep down, I was grateful for my magic in moments like this, since it made everything so convenient. If I wished for something, it happened, at the cost of mana. One of the men rushed at me with a stick raised, but I whispered quietly, telling him to fall. My wish took hold instantly, and he tripped before he ever reached me. I kept toying with the rest of them since none of them required any real effort to deal with. My only goal was to handle them without killing anyone. I grabbed a stick from one man and struck him across the face with it, using his body as a shield against the other's attacks. In the end, I took all of them down without ever revealing that I was a wizard. Once I finished beating them, I told them they should have put that same energy into organizing Robus's funeral instead. I then turned to the women standing with them and asked if they had come to fight me too. They quickly raised their hands and insisted they wanted no trouble, saying they had only come to greet me. I did not care either way, since they lacked the nerve to fight me the way the men had, so I told them to drag the men back down the mountain. Once I was back inside, I knew this would not be the end of it. They would likely try to overcharge me the next time I went to trade in the village. Still, it did not concern me much, since I could always beat them into giving me a fair price. I figured no one would dare bother me again after the beating I had just handed out. I had barely finished that thought when another knock came at the door. I flung it open angrily, demanding to know who it was, only to find a stranger standing there, someone who clearly was not one of the villagers. When I asked who he was, he explained that he had only come to ask a favor regarding his travels, apologizing for catching me at what seemed like a bad moment. I apologized in turn for my rudeness, explaining that I had just dealt with some uninvited guests. Privately, I was not even sure I had responded the proper way, since I rarely spoke to villagers, despite everything my mother had once taught me about manners. Trying to make up for it, I told the stranger he was welcome to come in if he was looking for a place to stay. Shortly after, I prepared what amounted to a feast for him. As we ate, we talked, and I told him that I did not speak much with the villagers since I had been born and raised on the hill, living as a shepherd my whole life. I mentioned that it was unusual for a town this small to see any travelers. He complimented me, saying I had surprisingly good manners for someone who had grown up alone as a shepherd. I told him I had learned it all from my mother, though she had since passed away from illness. He made a religious gesture and assured me she was at peace, since she had clearly raised a good son. Once the conversation settled, I asked him what had brought him all the way out to a small country town. He explained that he was there under contract, hired to deal with a monster troubling the village, and in doing so, revealed that he was a wizard. I was stunned by this. It did not take long for me to realize that he was the very wizard Robus had been talking about. The wizard told me he had a question for me, and I told him he was free to ask. He said he could actually sense a monster's presence nearby, though he could not see it anywhere, and found it strange that I remained so calm, despite knowing what had happened. He pointed out that I was the ideal target for the monster, yet I showed no trace of fear. He told me I looked remarkably brave for a shepherd who had never left this town. And then, in a calm and serious voice, he asked me who I really was. Then came the question I had been dreading. He asked me outright if I was a wizard, and that sent me straight into damage control. The question pulled me back to a memory of my mother, Back when I had once asked her what would happen if anyone ever found out I was a wizard, she had explained it to me using an analogy about bad nobles, telling me that if nobles were shepherds like us, then knights were like the dogs those shepherds kept. She said such nobles might treat their knights with what looked like love, as if they were family, but they could just as easily sacrifice them the moment it became convenient. She told me she did not want that kind of life for me, and she repeated again and again that no one could ever know I was a wizard, especially not other wizards. If they ever found out, she warned, they would take me away from her and turn me into their own dog to be discarded whenever they saw fit. She told me that to keep my secret safe, I might even have to kill. He asked again why I was not saying anything, wondering if his joke had gone too far, scratching the back of his head awkwardly as he waited. I stayed silent for a moment before apologizing quietly, admitting that I did not really understand humor. He shook his head and said he was the one who should apologize, that he should not have joked like that. I forced out a slight smile and told him it was simply the first time I had ever heard a wizard make a joke, though I had not known how to react right away. He said my reaction had been so interesting that he could not help teasing me a little further, though he admitted it had gone a bit too far. He then held out his hand, saying that after talking for so long, we still had not properly introduced ourselves. He introduced himself as Cain, a traveler, and it was a pleasure to meet me. I shook his hand and gave him my name, telling him I was a shepherd and 18 years old. He casually mentioned his own age, 75. I froze for a moment, telling him he did not look that old at all. He explained that wizards lived far longer than ordinary people and aged much more slowly. I asked him why he had chosen to become a traveler, and he told me he had served the Albion family for 60 years before finally choosing to leave, wanting to spend the rest of his years wandering freely and living life on his own terms. We went on exchanging stories with each other. For the first time in my life, I found myself talking with someone this easily. Before I even noticed, evening had already crept in. Cain stood up and said it was time for him to go. He placed a silver coin on the table, telling me it was an Arab silver coin, one of the purest kinds, more than enough to cover the meal. I stood as well and thanked him, wishing him a smooth hunt. As he reached the door, he turned back and told me he would likely be staying in the area for a few more days, so he might come by again to mooch a few more meals off me. A few days later, I brought the flock up to the hillside to graze as usual. Once they had eaten and drunk their fill, I called out for them to gather, and the sheep all lifted their heads and moved toward me at once. Even then, I was still caught up in the memory of that conversation, my mood unusually light. It had been the first time I had ever met a wizard, and the first time I had ever spoken with anyone so freely. Over the days we spent together, I had confirmed one thing for certain, that Cain truly was a good man. I had always believed knights were nothing more than merciless attack dogs trained by arrogant nobles, but I did not know how to tell him that there was no longer any monster left on Mount Heiser. Meanwhile, Cain was searching through the mountain forest for traces of the monster, sensing that something was not right. Clear signs of battle remained scattered around, yet he could not detect the faintest trace of the monster's aura. He wondered if it had already been hunted down, and if so, by whom, or whether the village chief had assigned the task to another wizard besides me. He let out a sigh of relief, telling himself it did not matter who had killed it, only that the place was safe now. But at that moment, he sensed something unusual and spun around sharply. A sharp claw appeared right before his eyes, belonging to a hideous monster. A massive wound splitting open its skull with tiny fangs growing around the edges of it. His heart sank as he muttered in confusion about the wraith of a monster, wondering who on earth could have done this. Before he could gather his thoughts, the claw thrust straight toward him, slamming with a loud crash into the very spot where he had been standing only a moment before. A chill ran through him as he wondered why the wizard who had killed it had not absorbed or dispersed the magic power left in the corpse. Any wizard who hunted a monster should have known to do that. Instead, the corpse had been left to turn into a wraith, unless he was merely a novice knight who did not know the common rule, that failing to absorb a monster's magic power would leave it to turn into a wraith, or unless someone had a different purpose entirely. Whatever the reason, he had to destroy it now. A golden arrow condensed instantly in his palm and shot straight toward the monster, but the moment it made contact, the arrow shattered into powder. His pupils contracted at the sight. His magic had proven ineffective, and he wondered if the creature's power might actually surpass his own. In the next instant, the monster vanished from his sight entirely. He swept his gaze around, trying to locate it, when a string of bubbles suddenly rose from his own shadow. A grotesque claw shot out from beneath it a moment later, and he barely reacted in time to dodge the strike aimed at him. Looking down at the wound left on his hand, he felt shaken to his core. This was not something a mere knight could be capable of. At the very least, it would take a lower-ranking noble to stand any real chance against it. He never expected to encounter a wraith of this level in such a remote mountain village. Life truly was full of surprises. He lowered his head and resolved that he would not die here without a fight. Even if death came for him, He intended to take the creature down with him. He forced every ounce of his magic into his palm, preparing to strike its vital point the instant it lunged. Just as the monster reformed its claws and he prepared to unleash his strongest attack, a streak of blue light suddenly cut through the forest and pierced straight through the monster's head. He stared at the scene in shock. The wraith that had seemed unstoppable only moments earlier simply collapsed. Then a voice sounded beside him, asking if he was all right. When he saw that it was me, he muttered under his breath that a shepherd being a wizard was the kind of joke that could actually get someone killed, then added that I truly was a wizard after all. I calmly admitted it while reeling in the whip in my hand. He frowned and asked why I had not told him sooner, and when I stayed silent, he changed the question instead, asking why I had saved him at all when I could have simply walked away. I muttered quietly that maybe it was because I was kind. That answer brought back a memory of a conversation we'd had earlier when I had asked him why he went to such lengths, since with his abilities, earning far more money elsewhere would have been effortless. He had smiled and told me it was because these were pitiful people, living somewhere so remote without even basic protection. I had replied that their situation was not his fault, but he had said that wizards were born inheriting the power of the gods, and because of that they ought to protect those who could not protect themselves. Not every wizard shared that belief, he admitted, but in his view, every person should live by their own convictions. I repeated his words back to him. Every person ought to have their own beliefs and their own way of living. At that moment, the wraith that had already collapsed suddenly sprang back to life and lunged at us again. We dodged together, and he made sure I understood clearly that this monster's level was far beyond what either of us could face head-on, that only a noble would stand any real chance against it. He told me to notify the village chief and get the villagers evacuated immediately, saying he would stay behind to hold it off himself. He knew he was overreaching, with no idea how long he could last, but he chose to stand his ground regardless. I told him only that it would be fine, then activated the magic power within me. Watching me move, he was stunned, realizing that my earlier strike had not even been my full strength. A young knight hidden away in the mountains, capable of hunting a wraith that even nobles approached with caution. That was his judgment of me in that moment. What stood before him was neither the bluff of some mountain boy, nor the reckless impulse of a fugitive knight. What he was witnessing might well be the beginning of something that would overturn the entire world of wizards. Around us, the stones on the ground began to rise slowly into the air under my control. In that moment, there was only one thing I wanted to know: exactly where my limit was. Cain had no intention of letting me take on that creature alone, since it was clearly no joke. Before he could even finish the thought, the creature's massive claw was already inches from his face, and just as he was about to be turned to paste, I smashed it away with another rock. Cain realized he was nothing but dead weight in this fight. He decided then to step back, stay out of my way, and simply watch to see what I was truly capable of. As for me, I noticed something was off about the whole fight. No matter how many times I struck the monster, it felt as though I was not dealing any real damage. That was when I heard Cain's voice call out, telling me physical attacks could not kill a wraith. Surprised, I asked what I was supposed to do instead, and he told me to use fire. I did as he said, conjuring flames along the creature's shoulders to try to stop it. But again, nothing happened. It kept advancing regardless. Watching all of this unfold, Cain could not understand what was going on, since this was basic knowledge every wizard was taught about dealing with a wraith, yet I was acting as though I knew none of it. Then it finally struck him that I must have been the one who had originally killed this creature and left its corpse behind. That meant I had never once absorbed mana in my life, which struck him as absurd, since it seemed impossible for someone who had never absorbed mana from a monster to wield magic this powerful. But it was not the time to stand around puzzling over it, so he shouted for me to form a fireball in my hand and hurl it straight at the monster. Hearing that, I got to work immediately. Cain doubted it would succeed, since creating fire on an external object was simple enough, but manifesting it directly in one's hand was an entirely different matter, yet none of that seemed to apply to me. I hurled it forward and it struck the monster directly in the face. The attack proved devastatingly effective, and the creature began writhing in agony, rolling on the ground in a desperate attempt to put out the flames. Realizing what it was trying to do, Cain shouted for me to keep pouring mana into the fire to prevent it from going out, insisting that we needed to burn away every trace of the creature to ensure it could never return. Before long, the entire area fell silent, save for the crackling sound of the creature's charred remains. Cain stared at the scene in disbelief, unable to accept that a rookie shepherd had just soloed a monster that would have given even a noble serious trouble. As for me, I turned to him casually, as though none of it had been a big deal, and asked if we were finished here. Snapping out of his daze, he told me there was still one crucial step left: absorbing the creature's mana, otherwise there was a chance it could rise again. Since I had no idea how to do that, He instructed me to imagine drawing something into my own body. I followed his instructions, and soon a green mist began seeping out of the monster's remains, flowing into my palm and through it into me. The instant it happened, I felt a sudden surge of power course through my veins. A sensation unlike anything I'd ever felt before. Watching my expression, Kane knew immediately that this had been my very first time absorbing mana. He was struggling to believe it even after seeing it happen with his own eyes. After piecing everything together, a realization dawned on him. To confirm his suspicion, he called out to me and, bowing his head slightly, asked which noble house I belonged to. At first, I had no idea what he was even asking. After a brief pause, I simply told him he was going to bleed out if he did not do something about the wound on his arm soon. Not long after, we were both back at the house with Kane fully bandaged up, though he still seemed convinced I was from a noble family hiding away here to live in peace. By then, I was growing annoyed at the way he kept addressing me, so I reminded him not to treat me as though I were some noble, since I was nothing of the sort, and suggested he simply call me Shepherd Boy instead. He apologized again, but he was still curious why a wizard like me would waste my days living on a rundown farm. This time I decided to tell him the truth, explaining that it had been my mother's request, one she held on to right up until the moment she died. He could not understand why she would ask such a thing of me. I repeated to him what she had told me all those years ago, that wizards were nothing more than tools to nobles, used for their own gain and discarded the moment their purpose was fulfilled. Surprisingly, he agreed with that view entirely, remarking that my mother had been a wise woman. That caught me off guard, since I had expected him to call her overprotective instead. He told me she had not been wrong, explaining that wizards possessed great power, but that power was not always a blessing, since it inevitably brought conflict with it. He told me about a war fought some 20 years earlier between two great noble houses, the House of Erebon, which he had once served, and the House of Zahar. That war had claimed the lives of countless people. 3,000 knights had fought on the side of House Erebon, and nearly a third of them had died. As it turned out, almost everyone close to him had been among that third, including a friend named Daenerys, who had dreamed of opening a shop in the city once the war ended. His own teacher, Hartman, and even his beloved wife and son, all of them slaughtered by House Zahar. That was why he agreed with my mother's decision, he said, because a knight's life could vanish more easily and more meaninglessly than a commoner's ever could. But there was one thing she had gotten wrong, he told me, and that was my aptitude. Simply put, he told me I was a prodigy. Though he admitted it was humbling for a knight with years of experience to be outclassed by a rookie like me, he said my potential was nowhere near that of an ordinary knight. At minimum, I stood on the level of a noble, and even among nobles, I ranked among the upper tier in raw aptitude. Confused, I asked how that could even be possible, since I was certain my father had only ever been a knight. He explained that in rare cases, a child weaker than a knight could be born to noble parents, and just as rarely, the reverse could happen too, a powerful, noble-class child born among knights. With that, he rose to leave. But before heading out, he told me I should reconsider spending my entire life shut away in this rundown home. Instead, he urged me to go out and see the world. When I asked why, Kane answered that this world was in desperate need of more nobles and knights, since humans were still not the true masters of it. Several millennia ago, he explained, humans had not been the only race to exist on this planet. Others had existed alongside them, but for something they had done, they were punished and driven out, though never fully annihilated. Now, in an age when nobles had forgotten their true purpose and spent their time fighting one another instead, the balance was beginning to crack, and that was exactly why the world needed strong, kind nobles like the one he believed I could become. That was only one of his reasons, though. The second, he admitted, was that he could tell simply by looking at me that I was not satisfied living as a shepherd. He was not wrong, so I asked him what I stood to gain if I left the mountain behind. What mattered more, he said, was for me to ask myself what I truly desired, whether it was wealth, fame, authority, family, friendship, or perhaps even a life like his own. He turned to leave, telling me to think over what he had said, since I had the potential to be adopted into a great house and walk a path of real power. Just as he was about to go, I called out for him to stop. I told him I agreed with what he had said, that I was not satisfied with my current life and wanted something more meaningful than herding sheep every day. Meeting him had also made me far more curious about the world beyond this mountain. He smiled and told me I had made the right choice, promising to support me in every way he could. But first, he wanted to know about my bloodline ability. I had no idea what that even meant, so he apologized and explained that it was something special, a noble awakened at birth, a trait inherited inherited from their ancestors and the very thing that set nobles apart from knights. He asked whether I had any spells that felt unusually easy to cast, or any outstanding ability that did not rely on magic at all. Since I was already far stronger than an ordinary person, I wondered if that counted, but he said no, since simply carrying mana was enough to strengthen a wizard's body regardless of bloodline. So I told him instead about my unusually sharp sense of smell, along with my ability to control rocks with magic. He was not convinced by either. Rock manipulation, he said, was a fairly common trait, too ordinary to be considered a true bloodline ability, and he asked me to keep going and tell him what else I could do. By the time I finished explaining, I noticed his expression shift. I asked if something was wrong, and it turned out something was. He had finally figured out which house my ability most closely resembled, the great house known as the Pursuers, or Hunters, called Zahar, the very same house that had murdered his wife and son. This left me wondering what I could possibly say to him. I thought about apologizing, but then it struck me that what had happened was the result of actions taken by family members I had never even met, people who were practically strangers to me. Kane noticed the worried look on my face and tapped me on the shoulder, telling me not to trouble myself over it since I played no part in that war. I tried to say something anyway, but he stopped me, saying this was an adult matter, and that trying to wash blood with more blood would only keep the cycle of fighting alive forever. I asked him if he had any regrets about telling me to leave the mountain. He admitted that if I pursued power by going down, I would likely end up joining the Zahar family eventually. But he said he trusted my character regardless. I had no idea what he meant by that. So he explained he was talking about the goodness in me, the same goodness that had driven me to save him from the monster, along with the fact that I had revealed my true identity to him despite hiding it my entire life. He said there was a real possibility that someone like me, if I ever rose to power within the Zahar family, could prevent a war like that from ever happening again. He turned to leave, telling me not to overthink things, since I had not even decided yet whether I would join that family at all. I stopped him there and told him my mind was already made up, that I wanted to go down the mountain. He praised my decision, but I told him I would not be leaving right away, that I planned to wait until his injury had fully healed. He seemed surprised by that and told me I was a good person. Later, he sat me down to explain the fundamentals of magic. He told me that using magic required mana, which was why it was often called the key to omnipotence, though he clarified it was not truly omnipotent as the name implied. To cast any spell, the mana used had to match it in nature. When I asked what determined that match, he told me the difficulty of any spell came down to 3 factors: bloodline, affinity, and causality. Bloodline, he explained, was determined by what a person was born with and applied mostly to nobles rather than knights. As an example, he said it would be extremely difficult for me to heal wounds with magic since I did not carry the bloodline of the race to family from the south who could perform such healing effortlessly without any training at all. Affinity, the second factor, was closer to familiarity, the idea that a mage could perform tasks more easily when they were things they already preferred or were used to. He pointed to how naturally I had formed a fireball, throwing it the same way I would throw a rock. I agreed, admitting that if I had tried to shape flames any other way, I likely would not have achieved the same speed or power. The last factor, causality, he admitted even he did not fully understand. He asked me what I thought would happen if I tried to kill him directly using mana alone, and I told him I imagined a bit of light might flash from his head, and nothing more. He told me that was exactly the kind of outcome that resulted from a lack of causality. He then placed his hand over a cup on the table, causing its contents to bubble instantly, explaining that effects like this occurred when there was no proper cause behind a desired outcome, especially when what was being attempted was far too difficult to achieve without one. I told him I had gotten the hang of it. If I wanted to kill him, all I needed to do was provide a cause of death that resembled creating and shooting flames, rather than simply spending mana to wish him dead directly. To prove the point, I lit a fire on the cup in front of us, explaining that killing him this way would be far more practical, since creating and launching fire followed a natural cause. He seemed pleased by how clearly I had grasped it all, telling me I could have made a fine professor instead of a mage. I told him I could control animals however I wished, and asked why magic beasts still needed causality of their own. He explained it came down to their own mana, and the two of us fell into a long, dry conversation about how magic actually worked. Eventually, he told me that the Zahar bloodline carried its own special magic, one built around stealth and tracking, and suggested I try it for myself. I agreed. I made a wish not to be seen, and to his surprise, it actually worked. When I became visible again, he looked genuinely unsettled, admitting it had been a long time since he had last seen that ability in action, and that it was a frightening one. He told me it was the very ability Erebon's knights had feared most during the war, though he assured me it was not without weaknesses. He then told me he intended to teach me further training methods, which made me ask whether he was not teaching too much to a mage from an enemy family. He simply reminded me that he had healed me and trusted my character. Later, I went down to the village to inform them I intended to sell the sheep and leave, having already packed everything I owned. The village chief panicked, demanding to know why I would make such a decision without consulting anyone first. I told him plainly to figure out a new shepherd on his own, since what I did with my own belongings was not anyone else's business. I did tell them to buy the sheep at a fair price, warning that if they refused, I would simply release the flock. I added that they were welcome to try catching the sheep afterward, though I doubted they would have an easy time of it. The chief was clearly frustrated, but he knew I was someone who followed through on what I said, so there was little point in provoking me further. In the end, he had no choice but to pay for the sheep, telling me to do as I pleased. After that, Cain and I set out together. I suddenly remembered that the village still owed him compensation for the monster, but he told me he had no intention of collecting it, since I was the one who had actually subdued the beast. Not long after, we reached a fork in the road, and he told me this was where we would part ways. He apologized for declining my offer to travel together, explaining he simply preferred to be on his own. I told him it was fine and thanked him for everything he had done. We said our goodbyes, and I told him I hoped we would meet again with smiles on our faces. As he disappeared into the distance, I finally understood the deep longing I had always carried for a father figure, one I had never quite been able to name until then. I continued my journey, and while crossing the desert, I spotted a group of strange people in the distance, wondering if they might be merchants traveling from village to village. I approached them to ask for directions. At first, they seemed to think I was trying to challenge them, but I explained I was traveling alone and simply needed directions to the nearest city. A man with an eye patch told me to follow the road they had come from, revealing that it would lead me to a city called Murai. I thanked them and turned to leave, but before I could go, the man stopped me, saying I could not receive information for free, that I owed them something in return. Before I fully understood what was happening, the group had surrounded me, weapons drawn. That was when it became clear I was dealing with bandits. The man with the eye patch told me I was standing in a wasteland where no one would think it strange if someone turned up dead, urging me to hand over my belongings while they were still being generous, since killing me would only cause them more trouble. I told them, since they were the kind of people who killed for a living, I might as well use them for practice. Those words drew a burst of laughter from them, one of them mocking the lunatic who actually believed he was some kind of wizard. I raised my palm and spoke a single word, wind, and several of them were lifted straight into the air. I thought to myself that Cain had been right. Giving magic a clear cause could drastically reduce how much mana it consumed, since even a small amount of magic power had produced wind pressure that strong. I uncorked my water skin and drew the water out with magic, forcibly enlarging, compressing, and solidifying it into a dense mass. In the next instant, several ice spikes formed around me. The bandits' faces went pale with terror at the sight, but before any of them could flee, the spikes had already pierced straight through them. Just as I was about to press the attack further, their leader hurriedly dropped to beg for mercy, insisting they had not known I was a wizard and pleading for his life. But before he could even finish speaking, one of his men lunged at me from the side with a weapon in hand. I lifted my right foot lightly, then stomped down hard, and several spikes of earth shot up from the ground instantly, piercing straight through him. Their leader stared at the scene in utter shock, unable to comprehend how any of it was possible. And just like that, it was over. I told him I had a question. After witnessing such a one-sided, crushing defeat, he had no will left to resist. I asked him why he had attacked me for no reason at all, whether it had never crossed his mind that someone traveling alone might also be a wizard. He answered immediately that it was because I had lowered my head to them, and even though they had treated me rudely, I had still bowed in thanks, which had convinced them I was nothing more than an ordinary person. Hearing that, I thanked him as well, since he had just taught me something important. A flicker of hope lit up in his eyes, and he asked if I would let him go. But before he could finish the thought, water droplets had already begun gathering rapidly above his head. I did this because Cain had once warned me that once I set out on my journey, I would meet all kinds of people. But when it came to vermin like bandits, I could never afford to go soft. If I let one go today, 10 or even 100 innocent people might die tomorrow because of it. So I did not hesitate and killed him where he knelt. After that, I continued forward, following the wagon tracks left behind. My heart was in chaos in that moment, weighed down by the fact that I had just killed people. I felt the guilt of it, but I knew I could not have simply let them go. Cain's warning kept echoing through my mind, that a swarm of people willing to rob and kill for profit could just as easily turn their blades on the next traveler who crossed their path. The wagon tracks stretched across the sand before slowly disappearing beneath the weeds, and as I turned Cain's teachings over in my mind, the turmoil inside me gradually settled. Then I stepped into an entirely new world. I stood there stunned, realizing that the city the bandit leader had mentioned, Murai, was the very one now spread out before me. I looked around, curious, since it was the first time I had ever seen so many people gathered in one place, and the buildings here bore no resemblance to anything back in the village. Unsure where to go next in such unfamiliar surroundings, I remembered what Kane had told me, that if I ever wanted to rest somewhere unfamiliar, I should simply look for an inn, since every village and city always had one. I turned to ask a fruit vendor nearby for directions. At first, he asked politely what I wanted to buy, but the moment he realized I only wanted directions, his attitude shifted immediately. I did not understand the hostility at all, wondering if the city had some unspoken rule requiring people to buy fruit before they were allowed to ask a question. So I pointed to a nearby apple and asked its price. Only once he saw me pull out coins did his tone soften, asking what an outsider like me needed to know. I placed a silver coin in his hand and asked where I could find an inn. He told me to follow the road behind the cloak shop, then turn left, where I would find a building with a blue roof, the largest inn in the city. I made my way there and was greeted by one of the staff, a woman named Lena. I asked how much it cost to stay for one night, and she told me cheerfully that it would be 16 dublins. After confirming the price, I paid, then asked her whether there were any monster bounties available nearby. I asked because I needed to hunt monsters and absorb magic power, and Kane had told me that taking on bounties would not only make me stronger, but also earn me money. When Lena stayed silent, I asked again, and she simply told me that nothing in this world came for free.
Women.
I handed her a few more coins, and only then did she tell me that if I wanted to take bounties, I would need to go to City Hall, the place that handled all public affairs, staffed entirely by people employed under the city lord. Since the sun had already set, it was likely closed by then, so she suggested I go the next day instead. She then asked, out of curiosity, whether I was a monster hunter as well. I had no idea what that term even meant, so she explained that some people claimed ordinary humans could become wizards simply by killing monsters, and asked if that was what I was after too. Just then, a hand landed on my shoulder, and a man spoke up, insisting the rumor was true, that becoming a wizard by killing monsters was entirely real, and that he had seen it happen with his own eyes. Lena looked at him in surprise, asking if he was actually still alive. He replied that he had already told her he would not die until he became a wizard himself. I brushed his hand off my shoulder and asked him directly whether an ordinary person really could become a wizard by killing a monster. He told me that in order for a wizard to grow stronger, they had to kill monsters, and by that same logic, ordinary people who killed monsters could become wizards too. He and his 3 companions were hunting for exactly that reason, chasing the chance to become powerful wizards themselves. I pressed further, asking if anyone had actually succeeded so far. He scoffed at the idea, saying that was impossible in a city like this, where only the lord and his 3 subordinates were wizards to begin with. He then looked me over and questioned whether I seriously intended to hunt monsters with equipment as shabby as mine. I did not argue, since he was not wrong. The only weapon I owned that looked even remotely decent was my slingshot, and even that could barely take down something the size of an egg. Even so, he offered to let me join their team, saying they were short one shooter, and that I was welcome to hunt with them if I wanted. I turned him down without hesitation, since I had no real reason to tag along with strangers. Once I lay down on the bed, I found myself replaying the events of the day. The outside world really was as chaotic as I had imagined, and even now, it was still hard to believe I had actually left the village behind. If anything, that disbelief only made me more curious about what waited ahead. Just then, I heard a knock at the door. I sat up and asked who it was.
Yeah, boy.
Before we had parted, Kane had reminded me more than once that even inside an inn, I could never fully let my guard down, since a city was no safer than anywhere else. Taking his warning seriously, I quietly gathered magic power into my left hand while reaching for the door with my right. When it opened, I found Lena standing there. She asked if I had already gone to sleep, saying she had worried the room might be cold and wanted to come warm me up. I asked her exactly what she meant by that. I did not understand what she meant at first. Lena moved closer and made it clear that, for a small amount of money, she would be willing to spend the night with me. My expression stiffened immediately, the whole situation leaving me deeply uncomfortable. In that moment, I remembered another one of Kane's warnings, that I should always be careful around inmates or prostitutes, since many carried diseases, and even though wizards typically had strong resistance to illness, carelessness could still lead to trouble down the line. Recalling his words, I refused her at once. Lena grew annoyed and stormed back downstairs in frustration. Back alone in my room, I let out a sigh, thinking about how the fruit vendor earlier had charged me just to answer a simple question, and now Lena had come offering something else entirely. It made me feel like cities were places where even the smallest conversation or piece of information seemed to carry a price tag. Still, while lying in bed, I overheard voices drifting up from downstairs, Mitten and his companions talking among themselves. One of his men asked why he had bothered offering to let a stranger like me join their group earlier, saying I had not looked like I would be much help. Mitten replied simply that I reminded him of himself back when he was younger, and that hearing I planned to hunt monsters with nothing but a slingshot had genuinely worried him. He said that if I stayed close to him during hunts, I might at least manage to survive a little longer. Listening to them talk from my room, I quietly realized that maybe the city was not entirely as cold-hearted as I had assumed. The next morning, I went to City Hall. I greeted one of the officials there, though he responded in a rather rude tone. I explained that I had come to hunt monsters, remembering Kane's earlier advice that the world would not treat me kindly, and that the easiest way to earn respect would be to simply reveal that I was a wizard, since ordinary people would bow their heads the moment they knew. Still, I chose not to reveal my identity. The official showed me a request concerning something called a crow monster, telling me it was the only job available at the moment. His tone still dismissive, he warned me that if I killed it, I had to bring the corpse back to the city myself, since any wizard who failed to disperse a dead monster's mana risked letting it turn into a wraith. Under city law, abandoning a monster's corpse after killing it could result in severe punishment, even execution. I understood that all too well already, given what had happened before, and I knew I could not afford to repeat that mistake. Before leaving, I asked why the knights did not simply hunt monsters themselves. He answered rudely that a knight's duty was to maintain order within the city walls, while hunting monsters outside those walls was work meant for people like me. I left City Hall, and sometime later, I returned. Every official inside was visibly shocked, unable to believe I had come back so quickly. They asked if I had truly killed the monster alone, and I calmly confirmed that I had. When I asked about the bounty, one of them rushed off immediately to fetch a pouch of coins, handing it to me and telling me to rest well after such hard work. The others kept staring at the monster's corpse in disbelief, amazed that anyone could have brought back a crow monster in such pristine condition. Then one of them noticed I was still standing there, and they all looked at me in confusion. I asked calmly whether there were any other monsters worth hunting. That only deepened their shock, none of them able to believe that this ordinary-looking man in front of them wanted to keep going. The scene later shifted to the inn, where Lina had prepared a table overflowing with food for me. With a bright smile, she told me she never imagined someone like me could take down 30 monsters in just 3 days, adding that I must have earned quite a bit of money in that time. I calmly told her that money was not my only goal. Inwardly, what truly mattered to me was the mana I gained from each monster, and thanks to those hunts, I had genuinely grown stronger. Looking myself over quietly, I realized my mana had already increased several times over compared to when I had first met Kane. Still, I understood that absorbing mana from nothing but weak monsters would eventually stop being enough to push me any further. Noticing something in my expression, Lina asked what was wrong. I asked her, half suspicious, if she had secretly taken a bite of my food. She denied it immediately, laughing as she added that I looked skinny but clearly could eat a lot. Just then, the chef appeared as well, proudly saying he had not cooked a meal like that in a long time and that he was glad I had enjoyed it. I thanked him politely and told him the food had been delicious. Suddenly, someone grabbed me from behind. It was one of Mitten's men, loudly remarking that I seemed to be enjoying something tasty, mockingly calling me a skinny runt and claiming he had heard I had been making good money lately. With a greedy grin, he asked if I planned on sharing any of it as charity. Without hesitation, I slammed my hand into his face. He cursed at me, calling me a bastard, and I looked at him with mock confusion, asking if he had not wanted charity after all. Another one of them threw a punch at me, but I slid past it easily and struck him down instead. A third came at me swinging a bench, but I stopped the attack cold and dropped him with nothing more than a single finger strike. Watching the chaos unfold inside her inn, Lina clenched her teeth and shouted at all of us to take it outside. That evening, Mitten came to my room along with his men, apologizing sincerely and assuring me it would never happen again, since he had already scolded them properly. He explained that their group had been short on money recently, and his men had likely grown jealous after seeing how much I had been earning. The two who had attacked me apologized as well. I asked if things had been difficult for them lately, and he admitted honestly that they had, so much so that within 3 days they might not even be able to afford their room at the inn anymore. Hearing that, I quietly handed him a pouch of money. He looked at me, surprised, asking why I would give it to him. I told him it was simply repayment for the kindness he had shown earlier, offering to let me join his group out of genuine concern for me. I made it clear, though, that this was not a gift, that I wanted information in return. His face lit up immediately, and he told me information was something he knew well. Sometime later, I stood alone on a cliff overlooking the city, looking down at the buildings below and thinking quietly that this might be my last hunt here. Mitten had already told me about the next city, so it felt like the right time to move on. Reflecting on our earlier conversation, I realized he had shared far more useful information than I had expected. I found myself thinking that Mitten was truly a good person. Unlike Kane, who carried the weight of experience and wisdom, Mitten felt more innocent, more straightforward. Then I caught something strange in the air, the smell of blood. I broke into a run toward the forest immediately, hoping my instincts were wrong. Before long, I found deep claw marks carved into a tree. Not far off, I discovered the body of one of Mitten's men lying on the ground. Looking further, I found Mitten himself lying dead nearby. Unable to understand what could have happened here, I heard a faint voice calling out from behind me. Turning around, I found a man on the verge of death, trying desperately to warn me about something. Sure enough, when I followed his gaze, I saw something staring back at me. A creature that looked almost like a rabbit, feasting on the lifeless bodies scattered around it. At first, I was not particularly impressed by the small furry creature standing before me. That impression did not last long. The thing moved with blinding speed, fast enough that had I been even a fraction of a second slower, it would have torn me in half. Realizing it was no joke, I pulled out my sling and immediately began firing rocks at it. Despite its speed, it made no attempt to dodge. Instead, it used its ears to bat away every projectile I threw. Seeing how easily it deflected my attacks, I knew I needed a different approach since it was clearly skilled at defending against ranged strikes. The creature did not give me the chance to reconsider for long. It leapt straight at me, but mid-air, it seemed to notice something was wrong, since I had suddenly vanished from where I had been standing. It skidded to a stop, searching for where I might have run, but I had never run at all. I was standing directly behind it, and the moment the opening appeared, I drove my weapon straight into its throat. The strike landed, but it was far from finished, swinging its ears back at me in retaliation. I managed to dodge in time, and used the opening to activate my bloodline ability again. In that same instant, it lunged toward where I had been, only to find nothing there. By then, the creature had fallen into a frenzy, tearing through everything around it. Then the forest fell completely silent. After a few still moments, it let out a pained screech and collapsed to the ground. This had been my plan from the start. I knew I could not beat it in a straight fight. With it finally down, I moved to absorb its mana and finish things. Just as it had with the tiger before, a green mist began seeping into my body, though this time the amount I absorbed was far greater. As soon as I finished, I heard the voice of the dying man beside me, filled with disbelief that I had been a wizard all along, asking why I had hidden my identity from everyone. I changed the subject instead, asking if he had any family I could pass his belongings to. He told me no. My mind drifted back to the night before, when Mitten had told me about a library in a nearby city called Orem, said to hold thousands of books, though only wizards were permitted to enter. That was no obstacle for me. After a while, I found myself standing before the resting places of the fallen men, paying my final respects and telling Mitten quietly that I was heading to that great city he had once spoken of. Sometime later, I was standing in line, waiting for my turn to enter the city. To my surprise, the city was even grander and more lively than the last one I had visited. A long line of people stood waiting to be inspected before being allowed inside, and I noticed one of the guards staring at me for a reason I could not immediately place. Sure enough, the moment it was my turn, he called out for me to stop. When I asked why, he told me I could not enter, pointing to how dirty my clothes were, and told me to clean myself up first. Once that was settled, I finally made my way to the library, a massive tower that looked as though it desperately needed repairs. As I stood there taking it in, I caught the attention of the guards keeping watch outside. I approached them and explained why I had come. They told me the same thing, that only wizards were permitted inside. I told them I was a wizard myself. They were not convinced in the slightest. I asked them to test me instead, and with no other option, one of the guards raised his arm to sense whether I actually carried mana. What he found left him stunned. Something terrifying lay dormant inside me, an amount of stored mana that seemed almost impossible. The guard nearly lost consciousness and dropped to the ground. His companion rushed over to check on him and heard him insist that I was no ordinary wizard, that I ranked even higher than a noble. He straightened up at once, introduced himself as a knight of House Voltus named Kenya, and asked which house I belonged to. So I asked whether that information was even necessary for me to enter. It was not, he told me, though there was still one condition. I would need permission from the master of Voltus before I could step inside the library. A few hours later, I found myself sitting in an extravagant bath, deeply uncomfortable with the situation. Whoever this master of the house was, he had welcomed me into his home and assigned 3 maids to scrub me down and rid me of the stench I had carried in with me. Unused to this kind of attention, I asked the women to stop, telling them I preferred to wash myself. That only created a problem for them, since failing to properly attend to an honored guest risked punishment from their master. In the end, I gave in and let them continue. Once they finished, one of the women stared at me in visible awe before quickly composing herself. After changing into fresh clothes, I apparently looked every bit the noble, and the women admitted they were not used to being treated so politely by someone of that appearance. I told them there was no need to apologize, which only unsettled them further. That was when another voice called out from the side. Turning, I saw a young girl with red hair enter the room. visibly surprised at how different I looked now that I had traded my beggar's clothes for something finer. From her tone, it seemed she had taken an interest in me as well. Setting that aside, I introduced myself, and she gave her name in turn, Yahello. Like everyone else so far, her first question was which house I belonged to. I told her I could not share that information for reasons of my own. That only deepened her curiosity, and sure enough, drawn in by the mystery, she decided to test me for herself, releasing a wave of overwhelming aura, waiting to see how I would react. I unleashed a blue aura from within me, its presence so overwhelming that everyone in the room was forced to bow their heads. Once the display settled, Yahello complimented me, then, almost as an afterthought, told me I should marry her. My expression went cold with shock and confusion, the way it usually did in moments like this. She tried to walk it back, claiming it had only been a joke, but before leaving, she turned back to me and told me to think about it anyway. Once she was gone, I looked down at my own fingers and noticed they were trembling. It struck me then that her mana had actually been comparable to my own. Not long after, I made my way to the patriarch's office to meet the head of the house, Rogue Voltus. After we exchanged introductions, he told me he was already aware of my reason for wanting access to the library, and made it clear there was no legendary ancient magic hidden inside it, no secret method waiting to boost my mana. I assured him that was fine, since I had never come looking for anything like that in the first place. He told me he had no intention of stopping me regardless, and revealed there was nothing within the library that counted as confidential to his house. Since the day had grown late, he told me to return the following morning, and I assured him I would not forget his kindness. The next day, the guards greeted me with genuine respect once they confirmed my library pass. Stepping inside, I was completely stunned by the sheer size and grandeur of the place. While I was still taking it all in, a boy appeared beside me, introducing himself as the librarian and welcoming me in, saying he would go over the library's rules. I was privately shocked that someone so young could hold such a position. He explained that the first rule was that I could not damage anything or I would be responsible for paying for it, and the second was that no book could ever leave the library. He added that he would be keeping an eye on me the entire time I was there. I asked him to give me some space while I read instead, since being watched too closely made me uncomfortable. Since he was the librarian, I asked if he read the books himself, and he confirmed that he did, offering to help me find anything I was interested in. He asked whether I preferred romance or history, but I told him simply that what I wanted was basic common knowledge about the world. Shortly after, he brought me a stack of books, admitting they were centuries old and probably would not suit what I was looking for, before bringing me a different set instead, saying these would serve me better. I thanked him, genuinely amazed at how remarkable the material was. The moment I opened the first page, it felt as though I had been welcomed into something close to heaven. I fell completely in love with reading from that point on, returning to the same routine every single day. Through it, I came to understand the world's geography, the different races that inhabited it, and the etiquette expected of wizards. I even learned how various goods were manufactured and processed. With every piece of knowledge I absorbed, the world around me, once an unknown blur, grew steadily clearer and more vivid. Days later, Rue called me back to his office, having heard how diligently I had been using the library. He told me that beyond treating me as a noble, granting me access to the library had also been an act of goodwill on his part, and now he wanted something in return for that goodwill. I told him to simply say what he needed. He explained that a monster had appeared north of the city and had been attacking travelers. I asked if he wanted me to hunt it, and he told me that 4 knights had already been sent after it and never returned. This time, he wanted a noble to handle it personally, but House Baltus could only spare 2 people at the moment. I was not entirely opposed to the idea, since protecting people was simply what wizards were meant to do, but something about the situation still felt off to me. Rug explained that the northern road had been blocked for the past 10 days, even though it was one of the city's most important trade routes. When I heard that, I realized the problem had started before I arrived in the city, which explained why he had allowed me to use the library so easily. Soon afterward, the hunting party prepared to leave the castle, and Azella was among them. She complained that her father was so overprotective that he had sent me along with them. Marvin Voltus, one of the Voltus family members, was also part of the group. As we made our way into the forest, Marvin asked if I was interested in Azella. I told him I wasn't, and he replied that hearing that was a huge relief. A short while later, we came across a wrecked carriage that had clearly been destroyed by the monster we were tracking. While the soldiers searched the area for clues, I was the first to realize what had happened. I told everyone the monster was a monkey. Azella asked how I had reached that conclusion, so I pointed toward a handprint in the distance and explained that the monkey had attacked the people in the carriage before retreating into the forest. I told them we should be able to find it by following its trail. Azella admitted that she didn't possess that kind of magic, and neither did Marvin. I interrupted, saying I would try instead. She looked surprised when she realized which bloodline I belonged to. I picked up a piece of cloth from the wreckage to lock onto the monkey's mana. After sensing where the mana was coming from, I pointed in the direction we needed to go. Not long afterward, we arrived at a stream where the trail ended. I explained that the monster had most likely washed its scent away in the water. Yahello was shocked that an ordinary beast could think to do something like that to avoid being tracked. I tried to reassure everyone, saying it might have entered the water simply because it wanted to. Suddenly, I caught the scent again and shouted that the monster was behind us. The moment I finished speaking, the monkey emerged from the trees looking even more terrifying than I had expected. It immediately began hurling stones at us. The rocks flew at incredible speed, cutting through several knights, but I managed to dodge them. To my surprise, I noticed that Azella and Marvin had used 2 knights as shields instead of trying to evade the attack themselves. I felt deeply disappointed and realized my mother had been right all along. The monster turned to flee, and Azella ordered the knights to chase it. Just as it seemed the monkey would escape, I fired a stone from my slingshot. It shot past Azella's head at blinding speed, tore through the knight's formation, and pierced the monster's body before slamming it into the ground. Azella and Marvin turned around in shock and realized that I had been the one who threw the stone. With the monster unable to move, Azella unleashed a massive fireball that completely engulfed it. The flames were so intense that they seemed to heat the entire surrounding area. I was impressed because I had finally witnessed the Valtis bloodline's fire magic for myself. After reducing the monkey to ashes, Azella admitted that she had felt genuine fear when my stone had flown toward them. While she and Marvin continued teasing each other, the injured knights cried out for help. She scolded them and told them to stop whining. One of the knights had even lost an entire arm, forcing the others to begin treating the wounded immediately. I was relieved that no one had died. Even though the attack had caught us by surprise, I believe the serious injuries could have been avoided. I was certain that Marvin and Azella were stronger than the knights, yet they had still used people weaker than themselves as shields. Marvin noticed the expression on my face and asked what was wrong. I told him it was nothing. Azella then invited me to absorb mana with them. I agreed, and the 3 of us gathered around the monkey and began absorbing its mana. I had read in a book that even if several people absorbed mana at the same time, the enhancement each person received would not decrease. After a while, Marvin and Azella stopped because they had reached their limits. To their surprise, I was still absorbing mana. Azella finally seemed to understand why her father had insisted that I accompany them. My spell proficiency and mana capacity rivaled hers, which was even more remarkable because I was a noble who had not yet reached my growth limit. Later, we returned to the castle. Marvin praised me, saying that we had defeated the monster because of me. I stayed humble and told him it was nothing special. I admitted that I regretted not noticing the monster sooner, which had allowed it to land the first attack. I also confessed that I hadn't expected it to possess tracking abilities. Both of them looked surprised, so I explained that monsters awaken different abilities depending on their physical characteristics. I pointed out that the monkey we had killed had unusually large hands and eyes, but those features didn't seem natural. I believed it had awakened the ability to throw objects with tremendous force, along with the ability to see over long distances or even see through the forest. Marvin was amazed by how much I knew about monsters. I told him I had learned everything from a monster encyclopedia in the library. He was surprised because almost no one visited the library, considering it a dull place. Azella admitted that she had gone there once out of curiosity, but the books were so difficult that she had left before finishing even half of a volume. I suggested that the next time they visited, they should ask the librarian for some easier books. Azella looked confused because she didn't know there was a librarian. Later, I returned to the library where the librarian greeted me enthusiastically. As I stood in front of him, I realized I had made a mistake because he didn't look like a librarian at all. I asked how he knew my name, and my question clearly caught him off guard. Realizing he had been exposed, he admitted that he had learned it from my library permit. He explained that as long as the permit remained inside the library, he could see everything that happened within the building. I then asked how I should address him. He replied that he didn't have a name and that I could call him whatever I wanted. Since he had no name, I decided to call him Librarian. He somehow managed to make the conversation even more awkward with his strange way of speaking. I asked if he was from the old empire. He replied that he had never been a person in the first place. Instead, he explained that he was a spirit and revealed that he and the library were one and the same. He told me his current form was simply a means of communication, shaped by what I preferred to see. I pushed back, insisting his form had nothing to do with my preference. He refused to accept that, telling me he was a reflection of what I wanted to see. To test this, I reached out and touched him, and my hand passed straight through him with no resistance at all. He admitted with clear frustration that he couldn't physically act on anyone who used the library. If he could, he said, he would have punished every person who had ever taken a book out without permission. I quickly realized something else. No one else knew he existed. When I asked him about it, he confirmed that until that moment, no one had possessed the qualifications to perceive him. His creator, he explained, had made him visible only to those above a certain level, which meant I was the only one who could see him. When I pressed him on what that meant, he said it came down to bloodline. I urged him to explain further, but he only teased me, telling me to go ask my parents. I had no choice but to tell him I was an orphan, and hearing that, he offered to examine me himself. He needed my consent first, and nervously, I gave it. He pushed his hand into my body and confirmed what I already suspected about my pursuer and hunter bloodlines, the traits belonging to House Zahar. Then he told me there was a third bloodline, one that was mixed, meaning I was the result of two people carrying different bloodlines. When I asked what the other one was, he admitted he didn't know because it was still locked. He explained that a locked bloodline wasn't unusual in mixed combinations, and that it would open naturally as I grew stronger. That was enough to confirm what I had already suspected, that my mother had been too educated to be a commoner and was very likely descended from nobility. I thanked him for everything he had done, and he suggested that if I was truly grateful, I should stay another month. I agreed, and from then on, he stayed by my side every time I returned to the library. Whenever I asked him to explain something, he gave me exactly what I wanted to know, drawing on knowledge that had been lost for thousands of years. At one point, he began teaching me the laws of nature, and it completely reshaped how I understood the world. I learned that disease came from microorganisms, and that decay in living things was caused by those same organisms feeding on them. I grasped other principles too, how light refracted, how friction generated heat, and how living things became injured and eventually healed. Later, I ran an experiment on decay myself, and seeing it work firsthand left me stunned. Everything I had learned helped me grow stronger as a wizard. I told him that some of the great houses were likely hoarding this knowledge deliberately, since if every wizard understood it, they would lose their advantage. Hearing that, he finally understood why knowledge among people seemed to fade with each generation. Before I knew it, a month had passed, and I told him it was time for me to go. He was caught off guard, so I explained that Rogue had already been dropping hints that I needed to leave. Devastated, he lunged toward me, begging me to take him along, but he only fell straight through my body again. I asked if he could leave the library with me, and he said no. He promised to look after me if I chose to stay instead, but I turned him down. As I left, I told him I would come back to visit, since there were still so many books I hadn't read. With that, I packed my things and left the city. Before going, I took a map from the library, and from it I learned that House Zahar's base, the Unreal Desert, lay east of Orem. I decided it was time to head there and start searching for clues about my parents. I wasn't in any hurry. If those clues were going to disappear, they would already have vanished over the past 18 years. And if they were still there, they wouldn't suddenly be buried just because I arrived a little later. I had no idea how long I'd been walking when a sound caught my attention, the neigh of a horse. I pushed aside the grass and looked over. A powerful horse stood stubbornly in front of a person, shielding them, while two figures with purple skin and white hair faced it down. One of them sneered that it was damning for a mere beast to have this kind of strength, and that they'd need to find a way in first. As he spoke, he spread his fingers and purple magic spread from his palm. That eerie magic caused the surrounding corpses to rise all at once. The moment I saw it, I understood immediately. These were dark elves, and what they were using was almost certainly the necromancy I'd read about in books. I hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to intervene. I didn't know whether the fallen people had provoked the dark elves first or the other way around. But in the next second, one of the dark elves picked up a severed arm and stuffed it into his mouth to chew. The female beside him asked whose hand it was, wanting one for herself, but he refused, saying she'd already taken one. My stomach dropped. They were eating people. I activated my invisibility at once. While the female was still complaining that human males were too hairy, I hurled a stone that smashed straight into the male's head as he chewed. Purple blood splattered across her face, and the undead beasts they'd summoned collapsed into a pool of black water. Without hesitation, she summoned them again. I threw another stone, but this time a goat-like beast knocked it aside with its horn. She ordered the creatures to charge toward where the stone had come from. A bull-like beast smashed through the trees, but found nothing, and she realized at once that I'd hidden myself. Enraged, she summoned a fox-like beast, and whether by scent or some other sense, it locked onto my position immediately. She shrieked that she'd found me, calling me a filthy demon, and sent the remaining beasts after me. I spread both hands, and a surge of flame gathered in my palms before blasting forward. It caught the fox-like beast, but the bull-like creature charged straight to the fire at me. I could only dodge to the side. The strength of these undead beasts far exceeded what I'd expected, and I was fortunate to have killed one dark elf outright at the start. A sharp pain then shot through my calf, and my whole body shuddered. The fox-like beast had sunk its teeth into my leg. I kicked it off without hesitation, but the bull-like beast I'd just dodged came at me again. There was no time to avoid it, and the impact sent me flying, coughing up blood on the spot. As I lay there gasping, the beasts closed in around me. The female dark elf laughed cruelly, telling me it served me right for daring to kill one of her people. Before she could finish, the horse guarding its master struck her with a powerful kick. Under its repeated blows, she staggered and began calling for help. The two beasts, about to finish me off, turned instead to attack the horse. Humiliated and furious, she screamed that she would tear it apart, but at that moment, a small stone pierced straight through her head, without her head to support it. Her body collapsed instantly, and with the necromancy broken, the beasts dissolved into black water as well. My abdomen was still cramping, and I could barely support myself on one knee, breathing hard. The horse walked slowly over to me, and I thanked it softly. Without it, I would already have been dead. As night fell, the person the horse had been protecting finally woke, and the moment he saw the scene before him, he let out a startled scream. I sat across the campfire without even lifting my eyes. Once his emotions settled, he asked hesitantly who I was and why I was there. I explained calmly that I was the one who had saved him from the dark elves. The horse came over and pressed close against him. He lit up with joy, stroking its mane and calling it by name, Tilly. Watching it approach, I said it was clever that it had known to protect its master and even to drag him somewhere safer. After a few exchanges, he told me gratefully that he came from the Burke family, and I gave him my own name in return. Not long after, I asked how he'd ended up in conflict with the Dark Elves. He said, his voice hoarse, that he'd been traveling with his servants when the group attacked them without warning. He'd heard other races described as cruel, but he'd never imagined they could be this cruel. Tears began streaming down his face as he spoke. Once he'd calmed a little, he apologized for losing control, explaining that he'd broken down because he'd lost the people most important to him. I asked if they had been his family. He shook his head, telling me no, they were the knights and servants who had raised him since childhood. I paused at that. Here was a noble who genuinely cared for ordinary people. I asked how many dark elves had attacked him and mentioned that I'd already killed 2. He hesitated before saying that should be all of them. I closed my eyes and spread my senses across the surrounding area, searching carefully, and quickly confirmed there were no others nearby. He asked, his voice heavy, whether I had some urgent mission. I told him I was simply traveling as well. Confused, he said someone as strong as me should surely come from a great family, and asked why I was traveling alone. I told him I wasn't that strong. In the fight, I'd only managed to kill one dark elf with a sneak attack before facing the other head-on, and I'd barely won because the horse had helped me. To prove the point, I deliberately released my magic power. Puzzled, he released his own in response, and the moment the two forces met, I realized he was actually stronger than me. If I hadn't absorbed the magic power of the 2 dark elves during the fight, I wouldn't have come close to matching him. He was equally startled, unable to understand how someone who could take on 2 dark elf necromancers at once had magic power only equal to his own. He wondered whether my combat instincts were unusual or my bloodline especially rare, but what puzzled him more was why someone like that would be traveling alone. Looking at me, he asked whether if I didn't yet have a destination, I would be willing to join the Burke family. As long as I escorted him safely home, he said, he would pay me for saving his life and for the escort together. Their family served as vassals to the great Abion family of the north, and for generations they had been enchanters who crafted magical items. If I agreed, he told me, they would custom make the perfect one for me. Soon afterward, we buried the bodies together. Aiz expressed his regret that he wouldn't be able to send his associates' remains back to their families. I told him he didn't need to be so hard on himself about it, since there was no easy way to manage that. He thanked me for it, and I asked why. He said it was because I hadn't mocked him, even though he was a noble, and that crying over the sacrifices of his subordinates made him look pathetic. I was surprised and asked why he thought that. He explained it was simply what his father had taught him, that those who fell in righteous battle would dwell in the heavenly palace with the gods, and that grieving for them was a sign of weakness. A true noble, his father had told him, was meant to move forward standing on the sacrifices that had been made. I told him this wasn't weakness at all, it was kindness. Aiz then suggested we start speaking more comfortably with each other, since we'd be traveling together, and added that he didn't think the age gap between us was significant. I agreed, and he stretched out his hand to shake mine, calling me a friend. I took a moment to consider it, and when it didn't seem like a bad idea, I shook his hand and told him I looked forward to our friendship too. Sometime later, Aiz suggested we rest before continuing the journey, and he brought out a strange chest. I asked what it was for, and he explained it was a cold storage chest, opening it to reveal several things he'd kept inside since his last visit to the city. I was amazed and asked if it stayed this cold all the time. He confirmed it did, saying most foods could be stored for about a week without spoiling. He showed me a few more of his inventions too, like a danger alarm that warned when someone approached, and mentioned that the clothes he was wearing were a magic tool with a self-cleaning function. I was stunned by all of it, since magic items like these weren't common at all. I commented on how impressive the cloth was, and he assured me that once we returned to his main house, he'd reward me with something far better, and that if his family wouldn't allow it, he'd make it himself. Ayaz then told me I was impressive too, since over the course of our travels he'd seen me use several kinds of magic: animal control, freezing, levitation, terrain transformation, liquid manipulation, enhancement, lightning strikes, and luminescence. He asked whether I'd spent my whole life practicing magic, or whether it was some kind of bloodline ability that let me master any magic I wanted. Deep down, I knew it really was an ability to learn any magic, but I chose not to say so. Instead, I reminded him that we'd agreed not to pry into which family I came from. He backed off, saying he'd only been joking, since he was fairly sure no such bloodline ability could exist. He then asked how old I was, since I didn't look very old. I told him I had a month left before turning 18. He was stunned, since he himself was turning 43 that year, but he assured me the age gap didn't matter. He said he should have suspected something when I managed to take down 2 wraith sorcerers, admitting he simply hadn't expected there to be 2 geniuses in the world. I asked what he meant by 2. He explained that we were similar in some ways, but the other genius had an extraordinary bloodline, his cousin Misa. I asked if she could make magic tools for me too, but he told me she was from the main house. When I asked what that meant, he revealed that she was a princess of Arabian, with every possibility of becoming head of a great house one day. He explained that unlike ordinary houses, the heads of great houses didn't easily pass their positions to their own children, since a great house often had dozens of relatives in the same generation, and at least one of them was usually stronger than the head's child. In this case, though, Misa, the head's own daughter, had been born with extraordinary talent. After awakening her magic power, she had mastered every form of combat magic within 10 years, earning the full backing of her house. At just 21, she was already near the level of the house's core members. I had to ask whether the house had held a funeral to give her that much power at such a young age. He confirmed it, explaining that when their great-uncle had passed away, his magic power had been devoured by her. Other relatives had received portions too, but she'd taken the largest share. Hearing that, I understood exactly how the great houses maintained their dominance. Soon after, we arrived at the Deccan Plains, the central territory of Arabian. Eyes led me to the territory of House Bergzavalin, a great castle. Upon entering, he was welcomed by his mother, and the two rushed into each other's arms. He began crying, overwhelmed by how much he'd missed her, and I found it hard to believe this was a 43-year-old man. His father stepped out and scolded him for calling his mother Mom so openly. I still couldn't quite process a grown man acting like a child around his parents. Eyes apologized, then introduced me to them as a friend from the south, explaining that I was the one who had saved him when he was in grave danger, and that without me, he wouldn't have made it back alive. His mother was startled to hear this, since the pilgrimage route wasn't supposed to be dangerous, and she asked what had happened. Ais told her they'd been attacked by dark elf wraith sorcerers. She lost her composure immediately, unable to believe the elves would dare go after her child, and shouted in fury, threatening to raise an army against them. Her husband urged her to compose herself, reminding her that she was head of the house and that people, especially me, were watching. He then asked which house I belonged to. I told him I couldn't say. Taken aback, he pressed further, and I clarified that I'd been born to a commoner mother and didn't even know who my father was. Eyes was shocked to hear this and turned on me, saying I'd never told them any of it. I told her I didn't think it was something worth boasting about. Ida's mother then assured me I would be properly rewarded for saving her son. However, she explained that offering me a room in the house would be difficult, though she'd arranged the best inn in the city for me instead. Eyes cut in, asking his mother why they couldn't host me at the house after I'd saved his life. She said it wouldn't normally be a problem, but as things stood, an important guest was currently staying with them, and regardless of circumstances, it was difficult to bring in a stranger of unknown origin. They were about to settle on this when a female voice cut through the room telling the woman she didn't need to worry since she was fairly certain the person who had saved Eyes wasn't looking to assassinate her. Everyone turned toward the voice, which belonged to a frail but beautiful woman in a long gown. Eyes' shock was immediate and he called out her name, Mesa, asking what she was doing at the house all of a sudden. The moment I heard her name, I realized this was the Princess of Arabian Eyes had told me about, though I was surprised at how frail and cold she looked. Eyes' mother explained that Mesa had nearly been assassinated by Zahar's agents, which was why she'd come to hide at the house. Eyes were shocked to hear there had been an assassination attempt at the main house, given that it was the most fortified house in the region. Mesa said there was most likely an insider, adding that it wasn't a secret that the main house had 1 or 2 people of questionable loyalty. She then excused herself, saying she was tired and needed to rest. Eyes' mother turned to their maid Ina and told her to show me to their second best guest room. After a restful night in a large, luxurious room, I woke early the next morning and went for a walk through the main hall. I ran into Eyes, who wasn't surprised to find me up so early. He asked what I was doing alone in the hallway, and I pointed to a lamp on the wall, telling him I found it interesting. He explained it was a magic lantern he'd made casually, and asked if I wanted one, since there were plenty in storage, but I told him I wasn't interested. Just then, an overwhelming light flashed through the window and caught both our attention. Aze told me it was Mesa practicing her magic. Watching the immense golden lightning in the distance, I asked if this was the Arabian bloodline magic, and he confirmed it was a storm bloodline. He admitted he'd never hated his own bloodline, but had to acknowledge that Mesa was becoming something close to a god at this point. That left me curious about just how strong the next Arabian leader would become. Eyes asked if I wanted to watch Mesa train, and I admitted I was curious, though I didn't think it was wise for a suspicious outsider like me to approach her. He said that didn't matter, since he could vouch for me as no assassin, and admitted he was curious himself about who was stronger between the two of us. I immediately realized this was the real reason he'd brought me along. He confessed to holding a grudge against her for years, and said he'd like to see her frustrated just once. He led me to where Mesa was training, and I introduced myself to her. She asked why the two of us had suddenly come to see her, and I said we planned to join her training session, reminding her that they used to do this together in the past. She shot back, reminding him how he'd once stormed off crying after she learned, in 2 tries, a spell that had taken him a full week to master. I nearly choked on my laughter, but managed to hold it in. Ayaz then shifted the conversation away from himself, telling Mesa that, among everyone he'd met, my magic talent was second to none, and suggested the two of us duel. The moment she heard this, she lost her composure entirely, unleashing so much magic power that it changed the sky itself and released an aura so terrifying it shook me to my bones. Once she finished showing off her strength, I was left drenched in sweat and shock. She told me plainly that I was no match for her whatsoever. I had nothing left to say. Aziz stepped in front of us both and said that if we were talking about raw magic power alone, he had to admit I really couldn't match Mesa. But what was truly astonishing about me, he insisted, was my talent for learning magic, something he doubted even she could rival. Hearing that, Mesa turned to me without the slightest politeness, saying that since Aziz praised my abilities so highly, she wanted to see what I was really capable of. Knowing full well I couldn't beat her in raw strength, I proposed that each of us demonstrate a spell the other didn't know, and whoever managed to cast the other's spell first would win. Even Aziz thought it was a good idea, and he asked Mesa what she thought. She agreed readily, though she pointed out that since I apparently didn't even know my own bloodline magic, using bloodline magic herself would be unfair. She decided to exclude it and offered to go first. Under Aziz's puzzled gaze, a fresh sprout burst from the flat ground, exploding out of the packed earth with unstoppable force and wrapping itself around him, flinging him high into the air. She asked me if I could do this, calling it the magic of creating and controlling plants. From above, Aziz shouted for her to let him down, complaining he was getting dizzy, but she told him to stay up there a while longer. I gave the vine a simple glance, then bent down and placed my hand on the ground. I understood immediately that magic which ignited flames was really just one expression of combustion, and magic that created water was really just drawing invisible moisture from the air. Growth worked no differently. Its true function was to make buried seeds grow at an extreme rate, meaning this wasn't creation at all, only urging growth. That seemed to surprise Mesa. She asked whether I'd immediately grasped the essence of the magic, and whether I had seen it before. When I told her I hadn't, she let Aziz down and admitted, somewhat begrudgingly, that he could be right sometimes. Then it was my turn to show her what I could do. Her words gave me pause because I knew clearly that using magic from the Zahar bloodline would be no different from seeking death. I looked to one side, as if recalling something, and reached toward a nearby flower bed. A rustling sound came from the flowers and a mouse darted out. Mesa dismissed it, saying animal control wasn't enough, that the creature was only a material to work with. The moment I caught the mouse, a deep blue magic power surged beneath my eyes and coiled around it, and its body began to rot. Mesa fell silent. I asked her if this was enough. She managed only 2 words in response. With a crook of her finger, a mouse walked to the hem of her dress. She grabbed it without hesitation and activated her golden magic power. But even after a long while, the mouse showed no sign of rotting. She couldn't understand what I'd done, sensing clearly that it hadn't been ordinary spellcasting. Aziz asked how I could use magic like that, calling it far too bizarre. I told him I'd simply thought of it on the spot. In truth, I hadn't expected that even a prestigious family like Avion would know so little in this area. That prompted Aziz to tease Mesa, suggesting they'd just let me win outright, but she snapped at him to be quiet, insisting she could do it. In truth, causality was an extremely complex element in magic. Whether the intended phenomenon could naturally occur, whether the user understood the steps behind it, how much magic it consumed, and whether that amount was sufficient. The ability to perceive how magic was constructed was the key factor governing both success and cost. The alternative, when that understanding was missing, was to compensate with sheer volume of magic power. Not knowing the underlying principle, Mesa could only will the mouse to rot while alive, and though the result matched her intent, the amount of magic she poured in was staggering. Aziz, watching, cried out that it had worked. Gasping, she declared that she'd succeeded. But moments later, she collapsed to the ground in exhaustion. Aziz rushed to her side anxiously, asking what had happened. I was puzzled myself. Simply exhausting one's magic shouldn't cause unconsciousness. So it seemed she'd been so utterly drained that she no longer had the strength to hold up her own body. Looking closer at her palm, I understood something. I picked her up and asked Aziz whether there was a healing-type wizard nearby, and when there wasn't, told him to bring salt and water to her room instead. Holding her, I was startled by how light she was, barely more substantial than a small lamb, as though she'd only ever been barely maintaining a body she couldn't truly support. And now, even that last bit of magic was gone. A long while later, Mesa finally stirred back to consciousness. The head of the Burke family, watching her wake, asked anxiously what had happened and whether she was all right. Confused about why she was in bed, she listened as he explained that Aziz had told him she'd suddenly fainted while training with a guest and asked if that was really what happened. Seeing her silence, he pressed further, asking whether I had done something to her, adding that they'd already confined me to the temple under observation. She told him no, that it wasn't my fault, that her collapse had been her own mistake, and asked for time to rest since her head hurt terribly. He paused, then mentioned he'd made her some soup, acknowledging she didn't usually eat because of her magic, but urging her to think of her health and eat at least a little. When she stayed silent, he sighed and turned to leave. Just as he reached the door, she said softly that she was thankful. Once alone, she glanced at the soup, then reached for it. But just as she lifted a spoonful toward her mouth, something surfaced in her memory, a terrifying scene of her mother and younger sister pleading with her. The bowl dropped and shattered on the floor. Her pale hands gripped the blanket tightly as she covered her head, shaking, trying to stop the memory from returning. Meanwhile, in the temple of the lame goddess within the Burke estate, a man rested his hand on the hilt of his sword and told me that the doors and walls there were as solid as muscle, tempered over 100 years, without the slightest gap, and that I shouldn't even think of breaking through to escape. I told him simply that I understood. He insisted again, with unusual seriousness, that the walls were extremely hard, leaving me unsure how to respond. Then he drew his blade and began swinging it. When I asked what he was doing, he said he was training and continued, thrust and slash, each movement efficient and purposeful, as if every step prepared fully for the next. Watching him, I thought to myself that this was what a well-trained body looked like. Noticing me watching, he fixed me with a steady gaze and asked what I'd seen in his movements. I told him it simply looked impressive. That seemed to satisfy something in him, and as he kept swinging, he explained that most nobles considered weapon skill insignificant, since attacking with magic was far easier, but that this was only because their bodies were weak and their will couldn't govern their flesh, leaving them dependent on magic alone. I replied calmly that unless a bloodline naturally leaned toward physical strength, specializing in magic really was more practical and efficient, but that once someone had truly experienced battle, they would understand that some situations couldn't simply be avoided, no matter how much they wanted to avoid them. At that, he held out the blade and told me to take it. I asked whether it was really wise to hand me a weapon, given that he was keeping me here on suspicion, but he said it didn't matter, that this was only an iron rod, and what made it a sword was the user's body. With my current weak body, he said, I couldn't possibly cut him. I didn't hesitate long before taking hold of what he called an iron rod. Under his steady gaze, I settled into a sword-gripping stance, and immediately a deep blue magic power began to gather around me. Hiram reacted immediately, shouting for me to stop channeling mana into the weapon. I complied at once, suppressing the energy. He stepped forward and began adjusting my posture by hand, telling me to shift my weight forward and let the ground bear the force of the strike. He corrected the position of my elbow, warning that weak form would fail against the weight of the sword, and kept guiding me, telling me not to set limits on my own movements. I followed each instruction carefully. Satisfied, he nodded and ordered me to repeat the motion 10 times, emphasizing my breathing and telling me to direct it into my muscles. As he watched, he remarked that I had an excellent body, one that simply needed to be properly trained. Mana, he declared, was nothing more than a trick. Many magicians, he said, assumed their physical abilities were already sufficient, when in truth they were only using the bare minimum of what their bodies could achieve. A properly trained body, he insisted, could dominate the battlefield without relying on mana at all, and he wanted me to understand that difference clearly. Breathing heavily from the effort, I acknowledged the lesson and told him I would remember it. The heavy doors of the temple suddenly opened, and I turned to see Aziz's mother stepping inside. She lowered her head deeply and asked for forgiveness, saying she had committed an unforgivable act toward their benefactor. I stayed calm and told her I should be the one apologizing, since as a guest, my behavior had been inappropriate. Though I was relieved to know Mesa was unharmed. She explained that Mesa wished to apologize properly and asked whether I had time to meet her. Later, I found myself alone with Mesa in a grand parlor. She stood by a large window, her expression thoughtful, admitting the whole situation was troublesome. She had heard I'd been confined because of her and apologized for the unnecessary commotion. I walked closer and told her it had been necessary and that what mattered was that she was safe. After a pause, she asked about the magic I'd used the day before, the one that caused the mouse to rot, wondering whether it was some undisclosed bloodline ability, given how absurdly high its mana consumption had seemed. I denied it, explaining that if she understood the principle behind it, she'd be able to use it just as easily. She narrowed her eyes, remarking that I didn't seem willing to reveal it freely, and pointed out that without proof, it could still be considered bloodline magic. I told her I didn't particularly care whether I won or lost. That confused her, and she said that if things ended like this, it would damage her reputation as Princess of Arabian. She proposed a deal instead. If I revealed the secret of that magic, she would teach me one of Arabian's secret arts in return. I smiled and accepted. I explained that at its core, the magic was based on bioenhancement, manipulating microorganisms invisible to the eye. Realization struck her at once, and she understood immediately why the efficiency had been so high, admitting she'd overlooked hidden factors in the process. With a quiet sigh, she conceded that she had lost, since even though she'd succeeded in the end, it had only been through brute force. I suggested it could still count toward the wager, but she refused firmly, insisting that in a true magical comparison, reckless mana output didn't count as skill. A little embarrassed, she asked if I could tell Aziz the result had been a draw, since she had no interest in watching him boast about a victory. I agreed. Then it was her turn to repay me. She picked up a comb and rubbed it against a surface, explaining that when objects were rubbed together, they could attract one another. Before she could continue, I interrupted, telling her simply that it was static electricity. She froze, her expression going blank, and asked if I already knew. I confirmed it. She muttered in disbelief that this was considered one of their most profound secret arts, and realizing it wouldn't suffice as repayment, said she'd need more time to find something I didn't already know. Until then, she proposed we train together, quickly adding that it was only to repay her debt, not because she wanted my company. I smiled warmly and agreed, suggesting we begin the next evening in the garden. That evening brought a grand dining hall filled with an extravagant feast. Aziz's mother humbly called the meal simple and urged me to eat freely. Aziz stared at the table in disbelief, saying he'd never seen a spread like this even on his own birthday, joking that anyone would think the Lord of Arabian himself had arrived. She silenced him at once. I observed quietly that there was nothing ordinary about this meal at all. The head of House Berg then turned to me, returning to our earlier conversation, and asked whether it was true that Aziz had promised me a powerful magic tool as repayment. I confirmed it. She asked what kind of item I wanted, and I explained I wanted something defensive, since attacking with magic was easy, but protecting oneself from sudden threats was far harder. She nodded, saying such tools weren't unfamiliar to her, though none were ready immediately. Aziz eagerly offered to make it himself, but she shut him down instantly, warning him not to disgrace the house. At that, his brother Milo stepped forward, offering to take on the task, explaining he'd recently finished a commission for the main house and had time available. Asked how he'd approach it, he said the best option would be a small wearable item, something like a ring, earring, or necklace, containing embedded mana and activating defensive power drawn from a guardian bloodline. The proposal was accepted, and when asked how long it would take, he answered 1 month. Their mother added that while it might sound like pride, Milo was already a highly skilled enchanter. I realized then just how significant this was. A magic tool crafted over an entire month by someone of his skill was no small matter. I expressed my gratitude but questioned whether it might be too much. The head of the house responded firmly, asking if I believed her son's life was worth so little. She then ordered me to remain as their guest for the month, telling me to make myself comfortable and treat the house as my own. The next morning, I walked through the lively streets of Zavalin with Aziz. He remarked that his mother seemed to have taken quite a liking to me, admitting he'd spoken highly of me the night before, praising both my talent and my dedication to training. Originally, he said, she looked down on me as a wandering noble without backing, but her opinion had clearly changed. I noted that it sounded like she was trying to recruit me into House Berg. He confirmed it, explaining that she often gave generous gifts, placed people in her debt, and then introduced them to suitable marriage prospects. and that many members of the house had joined the family through exactly that method. I found the idea troubling, but he reassured me that the magic tool was simply a gesture of goodwill and that I wouldn't be forced into anything even if I accepted it. He then asked what I planned to do for the rest of the day. I told him I promised to train with Lady Mesa that evening. Hearing there was still plenty of time before then, Aziz grabbed me and insisted we go out together, declaring that life was too short not to enjoy. He dragged me through the city, starting with a casino filled with roulette tables and card games, though I refused to join in. Next, he pulled me into a lively bar, and again I declined. Eventually, we wandered through the bustling marketplace, and I suddenly stopped, my eyes catching on a poster on the wall. The moment I saw the face drawn on it, my expression changed. Shock filled me. A single thought crossed my mind. Could this really be Kieran? Afterward, Aziz and I went to watch a stage drama where warriors clash blades to tell an ancient story. One set in the year 2195, when the warriors of Arabian marched into the demon desert. Among them was a knight named Kiorn, who, with divine aid, defeated the enemy after a brutal battle. When the performance ended, we both applauded. Aziz asked if it had been worth watching, and I told him it was excellent. In my mind, I recalled Kiorn once calling himself nothing more than an ordinary knight, and thought that kind of humility was unmatched. I quietly decided that if I ever met him, I'd ask whether the story was truly real. Early the next morning, I opened my eyes to find Harambird staring down at me. He asked if my body had rested well. I said yes, and asked why he was there. He explained that after watching me the day before, he'd realized I possessed a strong vessel and declared it was time to temper it, ordering me to follow him. When I asked if we were training, he told me a body didn't grow stronger by resting, only by being forged through effort. I agreed, thinking I'd gain more from this than from idle enjoyment. Just then, Aziz burst into the room, calling my name loudly and mentioning excitedly a performance he wanted to see. But the moment he noticed Haram, his expression froze. Haram calmly said we were heading to training, adding that Aziz should strengthen his weak body too. Panicked, Aziz stammered an excuse about having just returned and not being recovered yet. I watched him go, confused, but soon understood why. Haram's voice stayed firm throughout, telling me not to listen to my body's complaints and demanding more from me. When I began to falter, he scolded me, saying that yielding to pain meant letting the body dominate the mind. He ordered one final repetition, and I forced myself through it, my whole body trembling, before he finally let me stop. I collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. He asked if it was tiring, and I could barely manage to say that it was. He explained that I was fortunate, since as a wizard, this kind of training only needed to be done once. For ordinary people, the body weakened again over time and required constant conditioning, but for wizards, mana maintained the body at its optimal state once properly forged, so it wouldn't deteriorate afterward. He smiled slightly and declared I must be fully rested by now. I tried to protest, but his expression darkened as he insisted the body didn't lie, and without hesitation announced the next phase: weapon training. I let out a cry of exhaustion as it continued. The days that followed at Hausberg became intense but fulfilling. Every morning I trained with Haram in a special chamber where gravity was multiplied several times over, where even the slightest misstep could pin me to the ground. By evening, I trained magic with Mesa, who guided me through generating electricity by friction. Before I knew it, 3 weeks had passed. I attempted to fire a bolt of lightning at a target, but it veered off and missed. Watching from behind, Mesa remarked that I was struggling more than she'd expected. I smiled and admitted it was because I wasn't from Arabian. She agreed, noting it was difficult for her to guide me since she'd never approached lightning magic that way herself. I explained that aiming it was far more complex than simply releasing it. Suddenly, a voice called out for Lady Mesa. A man approached, casting a sharp glance my way and asking who I was. Mesa answered coldly that it was none of his concern, and demanded to know why he'd come, reminding him she'd ordered no one from the main house to approach her while she was recovering. He quickly explained that the patriarch had summoned her. When she pressed him for a reason, he reported urgent news. Dark elves were rampaging across the south. 3 cities had already fallen, and the main house was preparing an expedition force. The moment I heard this, I realized the Dark Elves had finally made their move. Mesa told the messenger to pass along her word that she'd return soon enough. Once he was gone, she said she had to leave, but then remembered she still owed me payment for the corruption magic I'd taught her. She asked if I knew that electricity flowed through the human body, and I was genuinely shocked to hear it. She seemed both surprised and pleased that I didn't already know, telling me this was an Arabian secret teaching, and that once she taught it to me, my debt to her would be settled. She explained that when a person sees or feels something, a tiny electrical signal travels to the brain, whether from the eyes, the nose, or any other sense, and that it was through this electricity that the brain understood sensation and sent signals back through the body to command movement. I didn't fully grasp it at first, but I trusted there was a reason behind it. since the library's teachings had matched this pattern before. I wanted to believe it was part of the natural laws Arabian had passed down. She asked what I thought would happen if I accelerated that electricity with magic. I answered that perception and reaction would become faster. She confirmed it, joking that I should just become a professor given how sharp I was, then decided to demonstrate the magic right away, curious to see how quickly I'd pick it up. Moments later, I tried the technique myself, focusing on sensing the electricity moving to my body, then pushing it to travel faster along its pathways. Before long, I could sense things in record time, so much so that even Mesa's speech seemed to slow down around me. I was overwhelmed by how powerful the magic felt. Then pain shot through my head, and I grabbed it instinctively. Mesa told me I'd succeeded, but explained that what I was feeling was the result of using large amounts of mana recklessly. She warned that I'd likely have headaches and trouble adjusting at first, but that once I got used to it, I'd be able to maintain it for a long time. I admitted that what she'd given me was worth far more than what I'd given her. She leapt into the air, and before flying off, told me to think of it as an investment, since I clearly had some talent. She said she'd collect everything I owed her once I reached my potential, then flew away, leaving me in complete awe. Later, Aziz and I traveled to the central city of Morgan to join the rest of the citizens in seeing off the expedition force. We spotted Mesa among them, and Aziz waved to his cousin without hesitation until his father grabbed his hand and told him to behave like a noble for once. Soon after, word spread that the house head was about to speak, and everything went silent. I saw Badal, the head of the house, emerging in the distance, looking like a beaten old man. I asked Aziz about it, mentioning how pale Badal looked and wondering if he was sick. Aziz said there were rumors that long ago, Badal had fought Zahar's house head and suffered grave injuries, though he believed it was simply old age catching up with him now. Badal stepped onto the stage and raised his hand. Clouds filled the sky, and the weather shifted instantly. As he addressed the soldiers, his eyes burned brightly, and lightning tore through the sky, striking fear into everyone present. The citizens began chanting Arabian's praises. I was left in complete shock, witnessing Arabian's true strength for the first time. Unable to believe that even in his current condition, Badal remained at the very pinnacle of magic. I promised myself that one day, I would reach that level too. Later, I was given the magic item that had been made for me, a bracelet. Milo explained that simply wearing it would slightly increase my physical durability, and that channeling mana through it would increase that further, eventually reaching a level comparable to a guardian bloodline noble. He warned that its mana consumption was severe though, and urged me not to maintain it for long. I was amazed by it, admitting that an item of this caliber was rare even among great houses. Just then, Aziz's mother asked if I'd considered joining the house. I thanked her for the generous offer, but told her it would likely be difficult. She wasn't surprised, since Aziz had already told her I had much to do and couldn't stay in one place. She apologized for asking again, and I told her I would never forget how kindly she treated me, that Aziz and the entire bird family would always be my friends. As I prepared to leave, I ran into Aram, who handed me a dagger. He explained it was a magic tool with no extraordinary function, but that it was durable and sharp. I accepted it gratefully, calling him my teacher. He smiled at that. Once he'd gone, Aziz draped a cloak over me. When I asked what it was, he reminded me I'd once said I liked his clothes, explaining that they resisted soiling and even repaired small tears on their own. He gave me shirts and pants as well, and I was overwhelmed by his generosity. He laughed, telling me I was a good friend, that it saved his life, and that spending time with me had taught him something about how to live. He asked where I was headed next, and I told him simply that I wanted to keep heading east. Hearing that, he said I'd find myself there, mentioning he'd been that way before too, and urged me not to take a ship if I could avoid it, warning that the waves were rough. I knew I had no choice, since beyond those waves lay Zahar's territory, the unreal desert, though I couldn't tell him that. He urged me to survive and come back, and I told him I would. Soon after, I set out on the road and quickly felt my solitude return. Alone again, I decided to run instead of walk, dashing off at blinding speed, passing other travelers who never even saw me. They only felt a strange presence sweep by, unable to catch up. After covering a great distance, I finally stopped when a strange scent caught my attention. It smelled like burning flesh, and I decided to trace it. The scent led me to its source, and I was left speechless. An entire village had been burned to the ground, its people tied to poles and set on fire without mercy. I wondered if it had been a bandit attack, since it seemed unlikely the Dark Elves would dare come this far. As I kept investigating, another scent led me to a cellar. I pulled open the door and found a young girl hiding inside. She screamed in fear, but I told her to calm down, assuring her I wasn't her enemy and that I was there to help. That seemed to ease her a little. I moved closer and asked what had happened to the village. She mentioned a wizard, but before she could finish, she passed out. I picked her up and, on closer inspection, realized her condition wasn't critical, just exhaustion from being locked in the basement for so long. I decided to carry her to safety, but by the time I reached the surface, I found myself surrounded by a strange force led by a woman. She aimed an ice bow at me, calling me a murderer and ordering me to surrender. The woman demanded to know the reason for the massacre, and whether kidnapping a child on top of it was somehow not enough for me. Before I could finish explaining that this was all a misunderstanding, her friend beside her panicked and summoned a fire spear, launching it straight at me without warning. It struck me directly. That reckless move only made her angrier, since I was still holding a child in my arms. But then her expression shifted to fear as she noticed a hand emerging from the smoke, and as it cleared, they saw me standing there without a single scratch, thanks entirely to the bracelet on my wrist. None of them could believe what they were seeing, that I had blocked a full-powered fire spell with nothing but my hand, realizing that something like that could only come from a bloodline ability. Fortunately, instead of retaliating, I simply repeated that I hadn't been the one who attacked the village, though I warned that if another attack came my way, I wouldn't hold back next time. That was enough to make her pause and reconsider. With the girl still in my arms, she also realized that attacking me directly would be risky, and she lowered her weapon. She seemed to believe me too, reasoning that no one would cause a tragedy like this and then stay behind just to save a child. To ease the tension, she introduced herself as Bison. Still, she made it clear I wasn't entirely off the hook and asked if I had any proof of my innocence. That proof, as it happened, was asleep in my arms. I suggested we simply wait for the girl to wake, since she'd likely seen the real culprit. That surprised the woman, since apparently no one knew who this man was or what he looked like. They referred to him only as the arsonist, and she seemed even more surprised that this was the first time I'd heard the name, since the man was infamous in these parts. He was a mad mage responsible for this and similar attacks, having struck isolated villages periodically over the past several months, always leaving no survivors behind. Because of that, no one even knew whether the culprit was male or female, which was how the nickname had come about. A short while later, the child woke and described the man to the group: a red cloak, a beard, someone who looked like a lumberjack. All four of them froze for a long moment after hearing that, then turned to look at me, who clearly matched none of it. Realizing they'd overreacted, they apologized for pointing their weapons at me so impulsively. It reminded me of Maiden, who had once apologized for his men's mistakes in a similar way, a trait I associated with honest, capable leadership. Since these people struck me the same way, I decided to let it go, understanding they'd only been trying to protect the child. Changing the subject, I asked if they'd come looking for the arsonist, and they confirmed it, admitting they'd made things worse in the process. Still, not everything was lost, since they now had a description that their tracker could use. That surprised me, since I hadn't expected to run into a member of the Jihar family in these lands, given their poor reputation here. But Bison clarified that wasn't the case at all. They were from the Carmine family, having come from Aicha. As for the girl, her name was Asha, a descendant of someone whose bloodline had mixed with a Zahar noble generations back. Because that bloodline had manifested weakly in her, she was skilled at tracking, but not particularly good at concealment. With that explained, Bison turned to more pressing matters, asking if I would lend my strength to hunting down the arsonist before he struck another village. She offered me the full reward for his capture, along with a share of his mana, saying all she wanted was the credit for completing the mission. Before agreeing, I asked what she knew about his power level. She could only say he was a noble level mage, confident in that assessment because some of the villages he'd attacked had been protected by several knights, all of whom he'd managed to defeat. That was exactly the kind of challenge I needed, since ordinary demonic beasts had stopped being enough to grow my strength further. With the reward on top of it, I saw no reason to refuse and accepted her request. First, though, I made sure the child was safe. We traveled to a nearby village where I entrusted her to the village chief along with enough money to raise her to adulthood, warning him plainly that I would return in a few years to check on her, and that if I found she hadn't been cared for properly or that the money had been misused, I would deal with him personally. He understood completely and assured me there was nothing to worry about. A short time later, we returned to the destroyed village where Asha used her tracking ability to pick up the man's scent. We walked the area together while she searched for his trail, and it didn't take long before she found his footprints. Since I had some skill in tracking myself, I was curious about her method, since it differed from my own. She explained that she started by searching for human footprints, then followed the scent of ash that clung to the man's body. And if he was still wearing the same clothes, she explained, tracking him down would become much easier. I wasn't entirely sure why, but I found myself somewhat impressed by how professional the girl was with her method. Just then, she told the group she'd picked up his trail, and soon we arrived outside a hidden cave where the scent led us. Knowing the place could be booby-trapped, she asked me to take point while the others covered our backs. Following her lead, we made our way inside slowly. At first, we saw no one, and she asked Asha if she was certain someone was here. Asha confirmed it, insisting there was definitely one person hiding inside. We pressed deeper into the cave, still finding nothing until Asha spotted a faint light ahead. Following it, we entered a chamber where a man stood alone in the middle. His condition was disturbing. Just to be certain, I asked Asha if this was the man we'd been looking for, and she confirmed it. Not wanting to repeat our earlier mistake, Bison stepped forward and asked for his identity, demanding to know if he was responsible for burning down the villages and killing their people. In response, he raised his hand, and an explosion erupted, engulfing all of us at once. The 3 weaker members of the group were knocked out of the fight instantly. My bracelet came through again, and thanks to it, I managed to shield Bison as well, which clearly startled him. Seizing the opening, Bison fired an ice arrow that pierced his thigh, dropping him to his knees. He was injured but not finished. He made a gesture with his hand, and massive stone hands rose from the cave floor, something that caught me off guard, since he'd clearly displayed a flame bloodline earlier. Reacting quickly, I leapt clear of the attack to save myself, momentarily forgetting about Bison, who ended up crushed beneath one of the stone hands. There was no time to worry about that, though. He raised his hand again to attack, but by then it was already too late. His entire arm flew off in a burst of blood. Still not done. I closed the distance, snapped my fingers to generate electricity, and blasted him with a full-powered shock, sending his already ruined body into convulsions. Moments later, and the stone hands crumbled apart as his control over them failed. Asha looked over to find me standing above his unconscious body and asked cautiously whether he was still breathing. I told her he was, then reminded her that her friends needed checking on more urgently than he did. Once she'd gone, I pulled some seeds from my pocket and tossed them beside him, and vines sprang up instantly, wrapping tightly around his body. Knowing how dangerous he still was, I also covered his eyes with a cloth to block his vision. With him fully restrained, I nudged his head and told him to wake up. The moment he regained consciousness, he immediately opened his mouth to chant a spell that would free him, but I was already a step ahead of him. With that, the group gathered around to begin questioning him, asking directly whether he was the arsonist. The man stayed silent, refusing to answer, and that silence earned him a stab through his other leg. Given everything he'd done, I felt he deserved far worse than death. I asked him why he burned all those villagers, and his answer left everyone stunned. He claimed a voice had told him to do it, insisting that burning the flesh and souls of sinners would grant him greater power. That alone was enough to unsettle the others, but he kept going, insisting this was the way to obtain other bloodlines, that he only needed to burn a few more people to finally claim the flame bloodline for himself. None of the others believed a word of it. It made no sense to them that killing people could grant someone a new bloodline, but for me, it struck different. I remembered hearing something similar before, from Maiden, who had once claimed that ordinary people could awaken power by defeating demonic beasts. Watching this man fight only reinforced that what he was saying might not be pure delusion after all. In that moment, I found myself thinking that perhaps I was finally beginning to understand the true secret behind this world and its powers. Without thinking too much about it, I cut the man's throat, killing him on the spot. The knights nearby looked as though they might be sick at the sight, and Bison asked what the problem was. They admitted it felt awful to kill someone who was tied up and unable to resist. She told them to stop talking nonsense, reminding them they could have died in that cave if things had gone differently, and that she had no sympathy to spare for a man like this. She added that no matter how much he suffered, it could never come close to matching the number of people he'd killed. I picked up his book, and from the very first page, I could tell it was enough evidence to confirm he was the arsonist. Flipping through it, I was stunned to find combination formulas I'd never seen before, and I wondered whether the voice in his head had given him these too. Just then, Bison called my name, saying it was time for us to absorb his mana. The group gathered together and did just that. Afterward, Bison received an award from her family for taking the man down. She told me they planned to keep traveling and hunting monsters for a while, then asked what I intended to do, handing me the reward money she promised. I told her I was heading straight to Aicha. She reminded me of what she told me earlier, and I assured her I wouldn't repeat it elsewhere, since it would cause chaos even without solid proof. With that, we parted ways, and I reasoned there was no reason to bring up the lack of definitive evidence. As I crossed the wasteland, I noticed that fire magic in the area felt weak, while water magic felt unusually strong. a sign I was getting close. Before long, I arrived in Aicha. I found an inn where a ship captain was talking to a colleague about how dreadful it was to cross to Onreal, recalling how pirates had nearly turned his ship into a sponge the last time. He said if things kept going this way, they'd be paying funeral expenses instead of sailors' wages, and mentioned how useful it would be to have a skilled knight aboard. I approached him and asked if he was heading to Onreal. He said they were leaving the next day, but that the ship had no room for extra cargo, and that taking on another person would mean leaving behind a barrel of liquor, something against his principles. I placed my hand on his cup and froze it solid. He froze too, in shock, and the sailors nearby looked ready to panic, wondering what a knight was doing in a place like this. I told him he could speak freely, since I was the one asking to be hired. He asked what had brought me there, and I told him I wanted passage on a ship to Onreal, assuring him I'd serve as crew rather than cargo, fending off pirates or sea monsters in exchange for passage. He warned me the ship was in poor condition and couldn't offer accommodations fitting a knight, but I told him I didn't care about pay or comfort, only about reaching the Onreal desert. Satisfied, he accepted the deal and welcomed me aboard. Meanwhile, far from there, the expedition forces fighting the Dark Elves were locked in a brutal battle. One exceptional knight cut through elves like paper, but was suddenly overwhelmed, and just as he was about to be overpowered, Mesa descended from above, turning his attackers to ash with a devastating lightning strike. He thanked her for the save, and she told him to rejoin his unit before he rushed off. Her uncle, Qadrim Arabian, the squad's vice captain, appeared moments later, asking if she was all right. She assured him she was fine, and he urged her not to overexert herself, reminding her she was far more valuable than the life of a knight or two. She told him she was more concerned with the progress of the battle itself. He said things were going well, that the area would soon be reclaimed, though they still hadn't located the tunnels. She told him to notify her the moment they did, promising to go there herself, then dashed off without waiting for a response. Qadrim was left groaning in frustration, convinced his brother had raised her too carelessly, fearing she might end up like her mother and brother before her. Back on the ship, I stood at the railing, thinking about how I'd find any clues once I reached Sahar's land. Without knowing my father's status, I had no way of predicting what awaited me there. All I really had were a few heirlooms and a portrait of my mother's face, and I wondered how long it would take to uncover anything meaningful with so little to go on. The captain came up behind me and asked what had me so deep in thought. I told him I was only thinking about how vast the ocean was. He agreed, then asked how I was handling the seasickness, since he'd heard landfolk usually grew nauseous just looking at that much open water. I assured him I felt fine. He mentioned he'd heard about my interest in learning seafaring, and I told him I simply wanted the knowledge, admitting that what I'd learned so far had proven genuinely interesting. Just then, the meal alarm sounded, and everyone sat down to eat before returning to work. While eating, the chef told me the food wasn't much, but that the pickled cabbage mattered more than it looked. He explained it was the reason none of them had died from gum disease. And when I asked what that was, he described a condition where the gums bled and eventually killed a person unless they ate something sour, which helped them recover. Since fruit spoiled too quickly on long voyages, pickled cabbage worked best, even if the taste left much to be desired. I was surprised and asked how he knew all this. He said he figured someone had worked it out at some point and the knowledge had simply spread from there, adding that before it was discovered, sailors used to eat raw meat instead. Suddenly, an alarm went off, warning of an approaching ship at 2 o'clock.
It's about to go down.
The watchman scrambled to determine whether it was a pirate vessel, and once it became clear no flag was flying, the chef concluded that it had to be pirates. The old man grumbled about their timing, annoyed that trouble had to show up just as things were going smoothly. The captain ordered the crew to prepare for combat. When the old man asked if they planned to run, the captain said they'd eventually catch up anyway, since their ship was faster. He then asked if I was all right with the situation, and I told him that as long as there were no knights or nobles aboard the pirate ship, there wouldn't be a problem. He ordered the crew to steer straight toward the pirates, ready to engage. The crew began praising me before I'd even shown them what I could do. Before long, the pirate ship closed in, and its crew shouted for us to surrender, promising to spare our lives. I asked the old man if that was true, and he said that if cutting off someone's legs before throwing them into the sea counted as sparing them, then yes, they were being honest. Hearing that, I leapt onto the pirate ship. The moment I landed, the pirates sensed trouble immediately. I drew water from the ocean and shaped it into ice spears. Their leader panicked at the sight and ordered his men to kill me on the spot, but I'd already marked every one of them for death given their reputation. Without hesitation, I unleashed the spears, tearing through them mercilessly. Their leader screamed at his men to stop me, but by then, I'd already cut down several of them. Still convinced they could take me, he ordered the rest to swarm me at once, warning that hesitation would cost them their lives. Following his orders, they surrounded me, aiming to overwhelm me together. I pulled more water from the sea and shaped it into a sword. The first man to charge lost his hand before his head even left his shoulders. Despite the brutality of it, The rest kept coming. As they lunged with their swords, I blocked their strikes with my ice blade, knocked the weapons from their hands, and opened holes through their skulls. One got close enough that I cut him down vertically. I grabbed a pole and used it to impale another man mid-charge, staying composed throughout even when one blade nearly caught me before I dodged backwards. I extended my sword's reach and, with a single strike, decapitated several of them at once. Then one man I'd already beaten down got back up and crept behind me, grabbing hold of me while two others charged in to finish the job. But their weapons couldn't even pierce my body. Before they could process what was happening, I drove my sword through the one holding me, then severed the hands of the other two before cutting them apart. From there, I went on the offensive, moving through the rest of them and taking their heads one after another, their screams fading as I sent them one by one to their death. By the time it was over, nothing remained but wreckage and carnage. The main ship dropped anchor to draw the two vessels together so the crew could board the pirate ship. They were left in complete shock, unable to believe I'd wiped out the pirates single-handedly. The captain teased me, saying that if I kept this up, there'd be nothing left for the rest of the crew to do. They sang my praises while cursing the pirates in the same breath. One of them noticed how bloodied I was and suggested I see a physician, but I told him it wasn't necessary since none of the blood was mine. It all belonged to the pirates. After washing up, I met the captain in his office, where he told me he'd searched the ship. It turned out to be a merchant vessel that had gone missing near Abaka some years earlier. The pirates had captured it and repainted it for their own use, apparently a common tactic of theirs. I asked what he planned to do about it, and he told me that since I'd been the one to finish the fight alone, ownership of the ship belonged to me. He congratulated me on suddenly becoming a ship owner, which caught me off guard. I asked what was typically done in situations like this, and he laid out a few options. I could sail it back to Abaka and return it to its original owner, bowing my head in hopes of a reward, though he warned that the paperwork and dealings with bureaucrats would eat up a month or two. Alternatively, I could take it to the Unreal Desert and sell it there. His real recommendation, though, was the Northern Sea Islands along our route, a region always desperate for ships, where the rule was to sell to whoever needed it most for the best price. Moving a vessel this size, he added, would require some of his crew, since I couldn't sail it alone, and if I used his men, I'd need to pay them for it. As we spoke, the crew was cleaning up the ship and dumping the pirates' bodies into the sea. The captain offered that if I gave them 10% of the profit, they'd help me get the ship to where it needed to go. I countered with a better offer, proposing he handle everything through the sale in exchange for 20%, and he accepted without hesitation, mentioning he knew people on the island who'd likely offer a good price. Just then, a crew member rushed in, telling the captain there was a mermaid aboard. The captain panicked at first, unable to believe we'd have to deal with mermaids right after finishing off pirates, until the man clarified that the pirates had been keeping one captive below deck. Hearing this, the captain, the old man, and I went to investigate. The captain asked if I wanted to see it, and I agreed. On the way, I asked whether mermaids sold for much, and the old man explained that a female mermaid would fetch a high price from wealthy mainland lords with more money than sense. When we reached the hold, we found the mermaid to be a young male. Much to everyone's disappointment, the captain remarked that this one would sell for very little, since nobles had no interest in male mermaids unless they happened to be a legendary royal capable of transforming into a fish. Overhearing this, the mermaid snapped at us, calling the captain an insolent fool for referring to him as just a male, declaring that he was Armani, the 47th Prince of North Estadale, and demanding the respect owed to someone of his status. I turned to the captain and asked if he was seriously claiming to be royalty. The captain said yes. The captain suggested that Armani might genuinely believe this claim was his only way to stay alive and avoid being sold, meaning he could well be bluffing. He asked Armani directly whether he could transform into a fish, and Armani said no. When asked why not, Armani explained that being restrained and out of the water made it impossible, insisting he needed to enter the sea in a proper state to transform at all. The captain and I exchanged a look, both suspecting this was simply an attempt to find an escape. The captain asked what I intended to do, and I asked in turn whether it was true that mermaids ate humans. He confirmed it was. I said I had no real choice but to kill Armani, since he wasn't worth much as he was, though I acknowledged it would be a huge win if his claim turned out to be true. Still, if we released him into the sea and he simply escaped, we'd end up looking like fools. I stretched my hand toward him, preparing to finish him off with ice magic. Armani panicked immediately, demanding to know what I was doing, and begged desperately for his life, insisting he'd never eaten a human and had no intention of starting now. That was enough to make me hold back. Sensing the opening, he offered me treasure in exchange for sparing him. I paused and asked if he meant it. He confirmed it, claiming there were relics left behind by the Freyon gods that humans worshipped. Not long after, we reached a dock, and while the crew celebrated finally making landfall after a long stretch at sea, I had other plans. I decided to take a boat out with Armani to the location where he claimed the treasure was hidden, since it wasn't far from where we docked, telling the crew I'd be back by nightfall. I bound Armani's hands in chains and loaded him into the boat before setting off. He asked if the chains meant I thought he'd try to run, insisting that as a prince he always kept his word. I ignored the remark. He then asked whether I was promising to let him go once we found the treasure, and I confirmed it before propelling the boat forward with magic. As we traveled, he warned me not to blame him if I ended up disappointed, explaining the Fran treasure was only considered impressive by the standards of land dwellers like me. I told him I didn't care, and that all I wanted was for him to lead the way. Soon afterward, a small island appeared on the horizon. Armani and I went ashore and headed further inland in search of the treasure. He struggled at first to recall the exact location, but eventually found a hidden lake tucked into the landscape, declaring with growing confidence that the treasure lay at the very bottom. The lake was nearly 300 meters deep. I stared at him in disbelief for a moment before deciding to take extra precaution. I tied him up again with a thick rope. He protested loudly, but I ignored every complaint, telling him only that he should hope I survived the dive. After stripping off my clothes and securing my belongings, I plunged into the lake without hesitation. The deeper I went, the darker it became, until ancient ruins began emerging from the shadows, remnants of some long-forgotten civilization resting beneath the water. Then something caught my full attention. Wrapped around a massive rock formation was an enormous serpent-like figure, and standing above it was what looked like a human statue. The sight was so striking that I nearly forgot the danger of being this deep underwater. As I moved closer, though, I realized it wasn't a statue at all. It was an actual human body, perfectly preserved, showing no signs of decay and no trace of having turned undead. Near the body's waist, I spotted a glowing object shaped like a golden compass, and I knew instantly it was the treasure Armani had described. I retrieved it and swam back to the surface. Once ashore, he asked eagerly whether the treasure was real, and I confirmed it as I looked over at him, something odd happened. The water around us reacted to his presence, letting me sense his life force and inner energy with unusual clarity. It only confirmed further that he truly belonged to a rare and unique race. Having kept my end of the bargain, I used telekinesis to tear apart the ropes and chains binding him. He stood frozen in disbelief, clearly having expected betrayal rather than freedom after everything. I told him simply that he'd guided me honestly, and so he'd earned the reward I'd promised. Relieved and grateful, he thanked me and even vowed that if conflict ever broke out between humans and the sea races, he would spare me personally. I took the promise lightly as I got dressed. Soon after, he walked to the shoreline and stepped into the water, and his body began to change before my eyes. Watching the transformation unfold, I finally understood that he truly had been royalty of North Estetl all along. The next morning, several sailors were being harshly punished for returning late from the harbor after causing trouble at a tavern. Curious, I asked what had happened and learned they'd ignored the captain's direct orders. Watching them, I noticed something strange. Most radiated a blue and red life force, a detail that immediately caught my attention. Later that day, I learned the one-eyed captain had gone ashore to negotiate the sale of the captured pirate ship, and I decided to join him. We met the buyer, Captain Samuel, who inspected the vessel and offered 1,000 Zahar gold coins for it. It was an enormous sum, but I had little interest in carrying that much wealth around, so I asked instead whether the payment could be exchanged for magical tools, rare artifacts, or holy relics of equal value. Samuel explained that finding such treasures locally would be difficult and suggested I visit Kamen City instead, the second major city within Zahar territory, known for a bloodline skilled at taming magical beasts and raising extraordinary creatures. The mention of beast tamers immediately sparked my curiosity. A companion capable of understanding human speech could prove invaluable during my travels, I thought. Back on the ship, the crew's mood lightened considerably after surviving both pirates and monsters, but that cheerful atmosphere vanished the moment dark clouds gathered on the horizon. The old sailor barked commands while the crew secured sails, ropes, and cargo before disaster hit. Moments later, violent waves crashed into the ship and several sailors were thrown overboard when a massive wave struck. To everyone's astonishment, the falling men suddenly stopped in midair. Unseen by the rest of the crew, I quietly used telekinesis to pull them back to safety, then secured the loose cargo below deck before anyone could be hurt. Even after everything was tied down, the storm only intensified, forcing the crew to retreat below and wait it out. I went below to check on the crew and make sure no one had been injured. They thanked me for saving their lives, and the captain admitted openly that the ship would almost certainly have sunk without my help. Seeing how badly the cold had gotten to everyone, I told him to gather around me. The captain panicked at first, worried I meant to light a fire on a wooden ship, but I simply snapped my fingers and conjured a controlled sphere of flame that floated in the air, warming the room without touching a single surface or causing any damage. The captain stared at the floating flame in disbelief, clearly having never seen this level of control before. In that moment, an old teaching he'd grown up hearing suddenly made sense to him, that humanity served wizards, but wizards in turn guided and protected humanity. Before long, we arrived at Comet City, one of the busiest cities in the region, its harbor crowded with mercenary vessels and the constant noise of merchants, sailors, and adventurers. Before we parted ways, the captain handed me a pouch of money. I tried to refuse, thinking the amount too generous given that we'd all simply helped each other survive. But he explained that the entire crew had voluntarily set aside a portion of their earnings from the pirate ship's sale, and that turning it down would only make them feel guilty. Hearing that, I accepted it and promised that if fate brought us together again, I'd treat them all to a proper meal. The simple promise seemed to move them deeply. The sailors gathered at the harbor to see me off. I answered with nothing more than a warm smile. Walking through the crowded streets, I sensed mana flowing through several people nearby, and my attention settled on a knight whose aura stood apart from the rest. I approached him directly and asked whether he belonged to House Durman. He immediately felt the pressure surrounding me and lowered his head instinctively, confirming his identity. I introduced myself as a traveler from Abaka and told him I wished to meet the head of House Durman. He escorted me to the Durman residence, where Cal Durman personally provided me with a fresh set of clothes. Once I'd changed, he remarked that the outfit suited me surprisingly well. After exchanging formal greetings, an awkward silence briefly settled between us. Eventually, Cal broke the silence, asking for my name and background. Staying cautious, I introduced myself as Torin Brahms, claiming descent from a fallen guardian bloodline, and explained that I'd traveled here after hearing rumors of House Durman's exceptional monsters. Satisfied, he agreed to help and decided his daughter would personally guide me through the estate. Before we finished talking, though, I asked a question that had been nagging at me since we met, whether he'd ever seen someone who looked remarkably like me. The question clearly caught him off guard. I pointed out that he'd hesitated the moment we met, as though recognizing something familiar. At first, he tried to dismiss it as unimportant, but eventually admitted I simply resembled someone he'd known long ago. As his daughter guided me through the estate, she remarked casually that I seemed wealthier than most members of a supposedly fallen noble family, since few people could simply walk into House Durman intending to buy a monster. She guessed that guardian bloodlines probably made for excellent mercenaries and adventurers. I offered no response, my mind still caught on the mystery Cal had unintentionally created. Thoughts of my mother surfaced, her curly hair, slightly large ears, and firm expression. I knew I'd inherited several of her features, but I couldn't convince myself that resemblance alone explained Cal's reaction. For the first time, I seriously considered whether the person he'd recognize might have been my father. I'd never seen the man's face and knew almost nothing about him. Before I could follow those thoughts further, we arrived at the monster breeding grounds, and the sight left me speechless. Vast rows of enormous chambers stretched across the property, each housing a different magical creature, every enclosure carefully built to mirror the natural environment of the creature inside. One particular horse caught my eye, so I asked about its price. Cal's daughter explained it had been raised under exceptional conditions and possessed outstanding qualities, which was why it cost 4,000 gold coins. Hearing the number froze my expression completely. Until then, I considered myself reasonably well off, but that price alone was nearly twice my entire fortune, and the illusion shattered instantly. Still turning that over, I continued through the grounds and stopped in front of another enclosure holding a large eagle. I asked its price, and she told me it cost 1,500 gold coins. A surprisingly modest sum compared to everything else I'd seen, so I asked about its abilities. She explained it had exceptional intelligence and remarkable flying skill, but that same intelligence had become its greatest flaw, since it refused to obey anyone it considered less intelligent than itself. I studied the eagle carefully, wondering if it truly understood human speech the way she claimed. Casually, I remarked that it still looked somewhat ugly, and the eagle's expression twisted with irritation instantly. That reaction alone was proof enough for me. She then mentioned she'd once tried teaching it to read, but it had stubbornly refused to cooperate, and she could never tell whether it genuinely lacked the ability or simply had no interest. She sighed, explaining that years of being fed monster meat had greatly boosted its strength and mana reserves, and that its value would have been far higher if it had been more obedient. As we talked, the eagle began making deliberate gestures inside its cage, but then it slowly stretched one claw toward me. She stared in disbelief, since the creature had never shown interest in any buyer before. I was just as confused, unable to understand why it had chosen me. Still, I decided to make an offer. If I bought it, it would have to agree to learn how to read. After a moment of consideration, the eagle nodded quietly. Soon after, Cal used his mana to form a formal contract between us, sealing the bond smoothly and making the eagle officially my companion. Before I left, He told me to take good care of it, then his hesitation returned. After a moment of silence, he asked carefully whether I had any connection to a man named Talis. The question caught my full attention. Realizing he'd said too much, he abruptly dismissed the topic and asked me to forget the question entirely. But the name stayed firmly planted in my mind. I became increasingly convinced that Talis was the person he'd recognized when we first met. Hoping to learn more, I asked a question of my own, taking out a picture of my mother and asking if he recognized her. He examined the image carefully, but denied knowing anyone by that name. Shortly after, I lifted the eagle by its legs, explaining that since I'd paid for it and completed the contract, it was only reasonable to confirm everything worked as it should. Moments later, it spread its wings and launched into the sky, carrying me high above the estate. When I returned later, Cal's daughter asked how the flight had gone, and I simply told her it was enjoyable. She soon began introducing me to several guests gathered at the estate. One man seemed surprised to learn I'd been living in Carmine, noting how close it was to Arabian territory, but she cut in sharply, insisting I should never be compared to those Arabian sparrows. The man laughed it off and introduced himself as Dolph Marin, a descendant of the history bloodline. As we shook hands, I felt him subtly tighten his grip, an obvious attempt to test my strength. He seemed pleased to find I wasn't affected at all, taking it as exactly what one would expect from a guardian bloodline descendant. Nearby, a woman showed little interest in the display and turned the conversation toward my eagle instead. I mentioned casually that I'd let it fly around earlier, since it had probably grown restless after a full morning of practice riding. When I called for it, the eagle returned immediately, and she looked genuinely stunned that it had actually listened. But the moment she tried to touch it, the eagle reacted with open hostility. Irritated by the rejection, she complained loudly, unable to understand why it favored a supposed fallen noble over her. As things settled, everyone gathered for dinner. Several guests brought up rising tensions caused by dark elf tribes in the western regions, which led naturally to talk of the Arabian subjugation force currently campaigning against them. Some mocked the leader's thin figure, joking about pity for whoever eventually married her, though everyone still acknowledged her ability, since capable successors already existed within the family. The discussion then shifted to the future leadership of Zahar, with several names mentioned as possible successors: Raymond, Alma, and Perga, among others. Unlike Arabian, uncertainty still hung over the matter, since Talis apparently hadn't decided on a clear direction for the family. Since both Cal and the other guests clearly knew who he was, I finally asked outright. Cal's daughter explained that Talis was the younger brother of the current family head, serving as second in command of House Zahar, and that many considered him the true power behind the family's operations. The explanation set my thoughts racing. The deeper I traveled into Zahar territory, the more it seemed my father might have been connected to people standing near the very top. That evening, I sat quietly with the eagle, sorting through my thoughts. What if the resemblance Cal noticed had nothing to do with Talis at all? For a brief moment, I wondered whether Cal himself might somehow be connected to my birth. If I turned out to be nothing more than an unwanted stain on the reputation of one of the world's greatest families, my existence could be erased without anyone caring at all. Just then, the eagle began scratching words into the ground with its beak, proudly writing that it was a black eagle. I praised the effort, but noticed several mistakes right away. I asked whether it had settled on a name for itself yet, and it wrote back that it hadn't decided. At first, I misread this and briefly wondered if "not yet" was meant to be its actual name, which only seemed to annoy it further. Curious about something else, I asked why it had chosen me in the first place. It wrote slowly that it liked me, and more than that, explained that something hidden deep inside me felt strangely similar to itself. Even as I corrected its grammar, I found myself turning those words over carefully. I already knew part of my blood came from the Zahar family. My mother's side, though, remained far more of a mystery. Before I could think it through further, Dolph Marin appeared, mentioning casually that he planned to go hunting and train for a while. I told him calmly that I intended to leave that very day. He looked genuinely surprised, complaining that I should have told him sooner. Despite his cheerfulness, I stayed cautious. He struck me as the kind of person who enjoyed proving his superiority through shows of strength. Still, he offered to personally guide me through the region if I ever needed help. I declined outright, telling him it wouldn't be necessary. He acted disappointed but accepted it without pushing, telling me to look for him if I changed my mind. That only deepened my unease. Soon after, I continued through the outskirts of Koman City with a night trailing behind me. I suggested he head back to the estate, but he explained that Cal had ordered him to see me safely to the city walls. Ignoring him, I stopped at a shop and picked up several supplies for the road, including a guidebook on the Enreal Desert and some religious texts related to the region. While reading, I noticed the author's name, Britzo Zahar, which told me the publication had almost certainly been sponsored by the Zahar main family. The map inside was disappointing, but the rest of the information proved useful. I paid close attention to the people around me, since my changed perception now let me sense mana in nearly everyone I passed. Eventually, the city faded behind me, and the vast desert stretched out ahead. Hours passed as darkness settled over the landscape, and by then, I'd already noticed someone following me. Rather than confront them right away, I let it continue until we were far from civilization. Without turning around, I told the hidden observer calmly that there was no point staying concealed any longer. A moment later, Dolph stepped out of the darkness, smiling, admitting he hadn't expected me to notice him so early. I explained that I'd chosen to travel on foot instead of riding specific. He claimed he'd only been worried about a young traveler crossing the desert alone, insisting he just wanted to make sure nothing went wrong. I wasn't convinced and told him plainly that I could see through him, that he'd had only one goal from the start. Rather than take offense, he seemed amused, admitting openly that I'd seen through his intentions. I told him I finally understood why nobles despised talking about fallen bloodlines. He told me my situation wasn't much different from his own, since I had strong mana paired with a weak body, which meant I had to belong to the guardian primordial bloodline. He admitted he didn't understand how I managed to pull up so much power, but insisted it was wasted on someone like me. I simply repeated his words back to him, then quietly told the eagle to take off, telling him it was too bad, since he was the one who thought he'd figured me out. I faded from his sight. He assumed I'd used stealth and demanded to know what I was planning, but the moment he noticed the entire desert had gone completely silent, he started to wonder why he couldn't sense me at all. Realization hit him just as he called out for help, and that was the moment I struck him from behind. Before he could react, I appeared behind him and struck several times in rapid succession, landing every hit before he could defend himself. Startled, he released flame in every direction, hoping to light up the desert and expose my position, but it failed completely. I vanished again and kept attacking from the shadows, each strike coming from a different direction than the last. Out of frustration, he raised his foot and stomped it into the ground, sending out a massive shockwave. Using that moment, he turned to flee, shouting for me to come out when he got no response. Sweat broke out over him in fear, and he decided to run, reasoning that since I came from a guardian bloodline, fighting a Zahar in the desert would be suicide for me. His footstep left a massive print in the ground, and he was convinced I couldn't possibly catch him unless I had a body-strengthening bloodline like his own. Then he noticed something in the air. It was me, descending alongside my eagle. I turned to face him and told him he was sturdy, but nowhere near the level of a true guardian bloodline. An ordinary noble would have died long before now. I asked if he had any defensive magic left. He shook his head, pleading for me to spare him, but I told him coldly that he already knew what was coming. Then I summoned a massive burst of flame from my hands and burned him to ash. When the flames died down, nothing remained but a charred body. Even after it was over, I stayed thoughtful. His durability had exceeded what I'd expected, and the fight had exposed real weaknesses in my offensive ability. If a properly trained member of the Zahar Guardian bloodline carried even stronger defenses, some of my current attacks might not be enough. I decided to absorb his remaining power, stretching my hand out to drain him dry, but suddenly, a second path opened for the mana to follow, and the treasure at my waist began pulling in his mana on its own, catching my interest immediately. I lifted it to examine it more closely, realizing it was an item meant for storing mana, and found myself wondering how exactly it was meant to be used, whether I could draw on it directly. But since it came from the Franz, I decided it needed more verification before I tried anything with it. After traveling through the night, I finally reached the area near the Tomb of God. Before approaching the site itself, I stopped at a nearby tavern to gather information, and there I met a young woman. After hearing everything I'd been through, she quickly concluded I'd essentially run away from home and wandered the continent alone, finding it hard to believe I'd survived so many dangers by myself. I simply credited it to luck. Our conversation turned to the tomb itself. I mentioned that according to several books I'd read, anyone could enter as long as they had enough money. That surprised her, since she hadn't expected someone my age to spend time reading books, and she assumed I must come from wealth because of it. She quickly added, though, that entering the tomb was currently impossible. About a week earlier, several important figures from the Zahar family had arrived, and access to the entire region had been heavily restricted since then. With even merchant caravans turned away, the area around the tomb was effectively under Zahar control. Meanwhile, deep beneath the Tomb of God, Purga Zahar and his companions found themselves trapped. Several members of the group kept blaming him for their predicament, though he defended himself, insisting his actions had been meant to secure an advantage for the family head. The discovery reminded him of stories his grandfather once told him, tales of a mysterious underground area said to exist somewhere beneath the tomb. He'd searched for proof of it for years without success, eventually concluding the stories were nothing more than legend. Now, seeing it with his own eyes, excitement consumed him completely, and he became convinced fate itself was guiding him toward becoming the next head of House Zahar. That excitement didn't last. The underground region turned out to be far more terrifying than he'd imagined. and he quickly began regretting his decision to enter at all. As time passed, things only worsened, monsters closing in around the group while their supplies dwindled. In the middle of that desperation, Purga suddenly heard a strange voice echoing through the passageways, and to his shock, he understood the unfamiliar language despite never having heard it before. The experience left him deeply unsettled. Above ground, I kept watching the situation unfolding around the tomb of God. The nobles clearly intended to seal off the entire location and monopolize its secrets for themselves. If anyone from the Zahar family noticed the same resemblance Cal had spotted earlier, my hidden identity could turn into a real problem. So I decided to stay inconspicuous for the time being. While wandering through the marketplace, I stopped at a stall and asked about a specific material. The shopkeeper identified it as saltpeter, and it immediately called to mind the research notes from Orville, the pyromaniac's book. I'd finally found one of the missing ingredients. The destructive power I'd seen in Orville's techniques had left a strong impression on me. My search then turned to sulfur. Most merchants had never even heard the name, until one trader explained it was usually found near volcanic regions, used mainly for disinfection and had little value in the desert. That left me a bit frustrated, since I regretted not looking for it back in Komad City. Still, traveling all the way back seemed unnecessary. As long as a volcano existed somewhere nearby, I could still obtain it, and the search simply became another item on my list. Later, I ventured deeper into the desert to experiment in private. Rather than relying only on stone projectiles, I found sand offered remarkable versatility, since unlike stone, it could be reshaped mid-flight. I learned to alter its form in the air, increasing its piercing power or spreading it wider depending on the need. As I kept experimenting, more possibilities emerged. Sand that could entangle an opponent's legs, disrupt their movement, or block their vision entirely. My thoughts eventually drifted back to the Tomb of God. Several days had passed since the Zahar forces sealed the area, and I seriously considered giving up on it and moving to another city instead. That thought didn't last though. If I could slip into the tomb and escape afterward, the potential reward was too valuable to walk away from. Just as I was weighing my options, unusual noises caught my attention. I spotted two men carrying a large sack through the darkness, their behavior clearly suspicious. The trail led straight to the restricted area around the tomb. From the shadows, I quickly pieced together what was happening. The guards were kidnapping civilians and forcing them to haul supplies into the tomb. One overseer ordered a terrified captive to carry cargo into a strange black opening, and the sight of it immediately caught my attention. Listening to the kidnappers talk, I overheard Purga Zahar's name mentioned several times, which caught my interest immediately. Since he was one of the candidates for leadership within House Zahar, his presence explained why the area had stayed sealed for so long. At first, I considered entering in hopes of rescuing the captives and perhaps earning favor with the Zahar family. But even before crossing the threshold, something about the entrance unsettled me. Despite that, curiosity won out. The moment I stepped through the black opening, an unexpected sensation swept over me, and my thoughts suddenly cleared. Only then did I realize something outside had been quietly influencing my judgment. The realization irritated me. Helping him didn't guarantee gratitude in return, and there was no real reason to believe he'd repay any debt at all. Moving deeper into the underground labyrinth, I eventually found Purga and his followers, along with one of the kidnapped civilians lying nearby, groaning in pain after collapsing from exhaustion while delivering supplies. Irritated by the noise, Purga ordered a subordinate to silence him, and the man responded by kicking the helpless captive in the head with full force. That single scene told me everything I needed to know about Purga's character, and I understood at once why his reputation was so poor. Any thought of helping him vanished. Then, a mysterious voice echoed through the darkness, repeating that someone was not the Night Hunter. Long ago, fertile emerald plains had stretched where the desert now lay, ruled by giants required impossible amounts of water to survive. When their thirst grew unbearable, they enslaved humanity, draining human blood to satisfy their need, slaughtering entire populations daily. Then, on a moonless night shrouded in total darkness, salvation came. The Night Hunter of the Freyans descended upon the land wielding unimaginable power and exterminated every giant, freeing humanity from its suffering. In gratitude, the people offered him the 3 most beautiful women of the desert as brides, and from those unions came 3 extraordinary sons, each gifted with a unique power. One could conceal his body completely, another commanded shadows, and the third wielded deadly poison. After the Night Hunter eventually ascended, conflict broke out among the brothers over control of the desert. The eldest chose to walk away rather than fight, while the younger 2 dragged the land into war. The conflict raged on until the eldest finally returned, defeating both his brothers and unifying the desert under his rule. That man became the ancestor of House Zahar. As the story echoed through my mind, I felt genuinely shaken. Not only did it describe a godlike figure connected to the Freyans, It also traced the origins of the very bloodline running through my veins. The realization unsettled me deeply. Technically, I was a distant descendant. Something suddenly approached, and I quickly turned toward it. I sensed something close, a trace of mana leading toward what seemed to be a creature ahead. I approached quietly to get a better look. It resembled a humanoid beast, twisted and unnatural, and the smell alone turned my stomach. Then, without warning, the thing locked eyes with me. Strangely enough, I couldn't quite believe what I was seeing, not until it let out a laugh, feral and grotesque. I barely dodged its first attack, then clapped both hands together and unleashed a wave of flame, burning it back. It turned out these creatures feared fire, and I used the moment to retreat quickly. I found myself wondering how they'd managed to detect me at all, until I realized their sensing range was narrow. Reaching for my favorite weapon, I decided to strike first, firing straight at them and sending one to an early grave. The other two barely reacted, standing there like they hadn't even registered the threat. I waited a while after they left, then tried to absorb the mana from the fallen one, but quickly realized something was off. What little mana flowed out was far too small to gather, meaning it wasn't a true magical creature after all. I felt oddly disappointed, since a body with that kind of physical strength should have carried far more. Even the holy relic didn't so much as stir. I found myself wondering what these things actually were. Then I heard the voice again, saying that I was not the Night Hunter. Before I could look into it further, Purga and his followers entered the area. I slipped into the shadows. Finding the dead creature, his group assumed they'd already passed through this spot before. Purga concluded an intruder had to be operating nearby and ruling out a rescue force, since any organized group would already have been noticed. Whoever was hiding was clearly acting alone. He ordered Galen to start setting traps through the surrounding passages. Alda was told to keep the area constantly lit so nothing could approach unseen. When Alda suggested capturing the intruder outright, Purga refused, smiling instead, deciding the mysterious rat would serve better as bait, hoping that letting it move freely would draw nearby monsters into the open. The standoff lasted 3 days. Purga's group and I remained trapped together in a strange coexistence within that endless dark. Thanks to the holy relic, I could see every trap Galen set and avoid it easily, while ironically, his own men kept falling victim to their own preparations. Unlike the nobles who constantly lost their bearings, I had a clear advantage. Using the relic's vision, I marked out several safe zones throughout the labyrinth and gradually pushed deeper into the ruins from them. Occasionally, whole passages were filled with overwhelming numbers of those creatures, and rather than waste time and mana fighting them all myself, I often maneuvered things so Purga's group ended up dealing with them instead. It meant giving up potential mana absorption, but I hardly minded, since the creatures carried so little mana that harvesting them barely seemed worth the effort. Purga's group kept suffering heavier losses. The surviving nobles gathered to discuss their worsening situation, concluding that the monsters were likely drawn to them because they still resembled a military force. One admitted that, if he'd known things would get this bad, he'd have kept the surviving knights alive instead of letting them die. Others complained about how inconvenient life had become without servants to handle basic tasks. Listening from the shadows, I felt nothing but disgust. Before long, another wave of creatures descended on Purga's group, and I saw the perfect opportunity in it. While the nobles drew attention and made noise, I pushed further into the labyrinth than I ever had before. Eventually, I arrived before an enormous stone door, unlike anything I'd seen, clearly built for beings far larger than any human. For a moment, I wondered if it might be an exit from the labyrinth entirely. Then the eye moved. Its massive pupils shifted and fixed directly on me. A strange voice echoed through the chamber, identifying me as a hunter pursuer, though it declared immediately that the necessary conditions hadn't been met. Then its attention shifted to the holy relic in my pocket, and its tone changed at once, recognizing it as a wave rider mimic. This time, it announced the conditions had been satisfied and asked whether I wished to enter. I stayed silent, the whole situation far too strange to process quickly. Instead, I turned over the unfamiliar terms it had used. Since bloodlines often carried unusual names, I briefly wondered whether Wave Rider and Mimic referred to dormant bloodlines within me, but the eye didn't seem interested in my bloodline at all. It seemed to be identifying abilities tied to the relic itself and combining that with my lineage to reach its conclusion. Hoping to learn more, I asked about Wave Rider, Mimic, and the entity before me. It explained that Wave Rider was a first-type ability granting underwater breathing, enhanced physical capability while submerged, and fluid manipulation. Mimic, another first-type ability, granted flow detection, absorption, and mimicry. That immediately caught my attention since I'd never displayed underwater breathing or consciously manipulated fluids. Curious about the entity itself, I asked what exactly it was. It identified itself as the spirit of the door, and to me it felt like some kind of librarian stripped of emotion and flexibility. I asked about the labyrinth next, and the answer proved far more significant. It is called the Labyrinth of the Night Hunter, explaining that anyone who slew the labyrinth's chief while possessing the correct 4 types would inherit the title of Night Hunter. Given the divine status tied to the original Night Hunter of the Freyans, I couldn't help wondering whether that title meant ascension to godhood. The spirit only clarified that defeating the chief would open a path to escape. Then everything went wrong. Its voice began repeating strange error messages, listing Hunter, Pursuer, Wave Rider, and Mimic, followed by a report of a 2-type error. The missing requirement was named Shadow Alchemist. Then a contradiction followed, as it simultaneously declared that all 4 required types had been fulfilled. More errors followed still, stating the identified types didn't match those of the true Night Hunter, reporting problems with the labyrinth's activation and declaring that it could no longer be closed. Internal personnel remained present. Unauthorized individuals had entered, and communication with its creator had failed, since the creator no longer existed. Unable to receive instructions, the spirit initiated autonomous judgment and issued a deployment order targeting the labyrinth's chief. As the final command echoed through the chamber, the massive stone door slowly opened. I readied myself for battle. Beyond it stood a gigantic humanoid creature, its body dwarfing everything around it. The moment its eyes found me, a cruel grin spread across its face and it declared me a fake. Realizing negotiation was pointless, I launched an immediate attack with both water and fire mana. It struck home, but accomplished almost nothing, barely registering as more than a minor irritation to the giant. Recognizing the gap in power between us, I abandoned any thought of confrontation and retreated at once. The creature roared in anger and charged after him. More giant creatures poured out of the darkness, converging on me from every direction until the corridors themselves became a death trap. I wove through the labyrinth, narrowly slipping past one attack after another. When one came straight at me, I raised my shield to block it, but the impact shattered straight through the defense, as if it were nothing. I slashed the creature's throat in response, and even mid-escape, part of my mind stayed fixed on understanding this place. It had clearly been built to create gods, yet I still had no idea who had made it or why. As the chase continued, the largest of the creatures lunged again, its massive hand grasping for me, but I outran its reach. Watching the pattern unfold, I came to a simple conclusion. This would never end as long as the labyrinth's chief stayed alive. Eventually, I would have to kill it. With that settled in my mind, I kept cutting down the monsters chasing me, one after another. Meanwhile, Purga and his remaining followers were living through the same nightmare. Days of fighting had already worn them down, body and mind, when the labyrinth chief finally appeared before them. Sensing the danger, Purga ordered everyone to attack at once, but the command came too late. The giant drove its claws straight through 2 of his men before anyone could react, and panic spread instantly through the group. Desperate strikes came from every direction, but the creature shrugged off or dodged them all, and their numbers kept shrinking with every passing moment. Purga could only watch as his faction collapsed around him, the weaker creatures alone having already pushed them past their limit. Against this thing, survival looked impossible. Amid the chaos, one man burst out laughing, comparing their situation to rats scrambling to survive. Refusing to give up, he charged forward and drove his blade deep into the giant's knee. The strike landed, and he erupted into manic laughter, celebrating the wound. That victory lasted only seconds before the monster seized him and hurled him into a wall with brutal force. Purga watched every remaining companion die around him. Rage consumed him, and he blamed the creature for all of it. In one final, desperate act, he climbed onto its back and struck it again and again, briefly convincing himself that victory was finally within reach. After all his attacks, he'd only managed to take the monster's arm, and he stood there in total shock, unable to react before the creature drove its hand straight through Purga's chest. Even in his last moment, he couldn't believe what was happening to him. Then the voice echoed again, but this time the monster's gaze had already shifted elsewhere. I was still hidden, watching, and I seized the opening at once. I lunged toward the creature and swung my axe at its neck. I struck the creature's shoulder with my axe, though I understood immediately that a single blow would never be enough to finish it off, and moments later it hurled me down below. As I recovered, I realized I'd already burned through my fire mana, leaving me with only one option left. When it charged again, I seized the opening and severed one of its fingers. It groaned in pain but kept calling me an imposter and a monster, blaming me for killing all its children. Taking advantage of the moment, I struck again and cut clean through its neck. Relief washed over me as the fight finally ended. I reflected that without the bloodline power I'd taken from Dolph, this would have gone far worse. I still wasn't certain about the Wave Knight power, but the imitator ability had clearly activated. Drinking the liquid to trigger it hadn't been pleasant, and I could feel it already fading, likely gone within 30 minutes. I checked on Purga afterward and knew immediately he couldn't be saved. Half dead and groaning, he begged for help. I apologized, since keeping him alive was simply beyond what I could do. As I absorbed the power from the bodies around me, I found myself reflecting on his life. A cruel man who treated commoners and knights as worthless, yet also someone who'd fought to the very end against the labyrinth's secrets. I decided I'd remember him for that, at least. Once the transformation settled, I wondered briefly what it might be like to run multiple bloodlines at once. Curiosity tempted me, but I decided that experiment could wait for another day, preferably one where I wasn't standing in a pile of corpses. I could already feel my strength surging, roughly twice what it had been when I first entered the labyrinth, power that would normally take an ordinary noble a century to accumulate. Thinking ahead, I concluded that abandoning the magic tool was my safest option if I wanted to avoid drawing the Tsar's attention, and I needed to erase every trace of my presence here. Using tracking magic, I planned to find and remove anything that could be linked back to me, especially since I just killed the labyrinth's sovereign, which tends to attract attention. With that settled, I ran toward the mysterious door and opened it to find a throne room, 2 suits of armor standing guard, and a single book resting on a nearby table. Picking it up, the book held records from an experiment designed to replicate the Night Hunter's ascension, describing a class change formed from the fusion of Hunter, Stalker, Shadow, and Alchemist. Another entry explained that the mechanism only activated when a compatible target was detected, with a function built specifically to lure that target inside. Reading through it, I understood at last that the Night Hunter was a fusion of those 4 bloodlines, and that clearing the labyrinth of evil was the true condition for ascension. The mention of luring a compatible target finally explained the strange pull I'd felt to enter in the first place. Further in, I found notes on the monsters themselves. One entry, labeled Rotten Jaw, listed giant blood, giant flesh, and the jaw of a giant queen as its base materials, alongside notes on mana as a power source, methods for extending longevity through hibernation, attempts to replicate acidic blood and fire breath, and efforts to push the creatures past their natural limits. The creator had concluded the results still fell short of the original dungeon. I realized the creatures had been built from the flesh of giants and found other references to an Earth Mother Goddess ascension experiment, along with notes on a previous failed attempt. Most of it went over my head, but one fact stood out clearly. The creator's entire goal had been to produce a Night Hunter because of the sacred relic. The gate had mistaken me for a candidate carrying all 4 required bloodlines, but both the Shadow and Alchemist lines had already gone extinct, wiped out by the Zahars long ago. That brought Orville the arsonist back to mind, who'd once claimed a god had shown him a method for artificially obtaining a bloodline. The idea fascinated me. If relics capable of absorbing and channeling bloodline power already existed, the concept suddenly felt far less impossible. Passing through the vortex, I emerged from the underground labyrinth back into the desert, somewhere near the outskirts of Banifel. Not long after, I found my eagle waiting, thoroughly unimpressed. It complained loudly about my 2-day disappearance, and I apologized for keeping it waiting, though I suspected the apology meant nothing to a bird that judges on principle. Grabbing its leg, I let it carry me back into the sky toward my next destination. As we flew, I reflected on everything that had happened. I killed one of the candidates for the next Zahar leader, along with more than 10 other nobles, and the entire desert was surely in chaos by now. It would only be a matter of time before someone pointed a finger at a culprit. So I decided I needed to leave the unreal desert for a few months until things settled. Once enough time had passed, I planned to resume the search for my mother. Remembering something, I pointed toward a distant direction and decided that would be my first destination. Eventually, I arrived at the gray city of Kalamath, recalling as I approached that this region had once been the battlefield where Arabian and Zahar waged war against each other. Something immediately caught my attention, though. The residents were carrying bags and belongings, clearly preparing to flee something. Then I arrived at the gray city of Kalamath. Reaching the gates, the guards noticed me, wondering at first if I was just an ordinary traveler. Then they took in what I was wearing and immediately bowed, asking which esteemed noble house I belonged to. I was surprised at how quickly they'd pegged me as a wizard and made a mental note to cover up more carefully going forward. I told them I was simply passing through and asked if they could request a day's hospitality from the master of the place on my behalf. The city had no lord anymore. The previous ruler had died recently in an attack by dark elves from the west, and since then, not a single noble or knight remained to govern the place. Realizing the situation was more complicated than I'd expected, I hadn't even finished processing it when one of the townspeople dropped to his knees and grabbed at my feet, begging me to become the ruler of Kalamath. All I could do was stand there in stunned silence as the request rippled through the crowd.